My name is Amelia Davis. I am 32 years old, a financial analyst at Davis Insurance Group in Hartford, Connecticut. And 10 years ago, I walked into that building as a 22-year-old with a degree from UConn and a desk nobody else wanted. Tonight, my father stood in front of 200 people and thanked every one of them except me. We were at the Wethersfield Cove Yacht Club. The doors were open to Long Island Sound, and I could hear the halyards clinking against the masts outside, while a string quartet played something I didn't recognize. My father, Richard Davis, was retiring after 41 years running the company his own father started with one desk and one key. I sat at table 6 in the navy dress I had bought for this exact night, waiting to hear him say my name. He raised his glass. Tonight, I want to introduce the person who will truly carry this company forward. He turned toward my cousin, Preston Whitfield, 34 years old, 18 months at the company. A man who had emailed our claims director that same week asking how to spell reinsurance. I built the risk model that kept this company solvent after the flooding along the Sound wiped out half our coastal book. I did that at 24, alone at my kitchen table while my father accepted the board's applause for it. I have not missed a single earnings call in 10 years. I found errors in our reserve calculations that saved this company $11 million, and my name is not on one page of the documentation my father filed with the state. I poured myself a glass of water. My hand did not move. I stood up before the applause finished, walked past the raw bar past a waiter I did not look at, and into the coat room, where I put my hand in my coat pocket and closed it around a small brass key that has lived there for 3 years. Nobody in that room knew it existed, not even my father. If you are watching tonight from Georgia, from Ohio, from anywhere that has ever built something with 2 hands and watched somebody else get handed the credit for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This is Still Waters Stories. Stay with me because what happened after that toast is not the story my father thinks it is. Through the coat room window, I watched him find Preston's eyes across the room. For half a second before the crowd pulled them both back in his face, did something I did not expect. It was not pride. It was relief. The particular kind you see on a man who has just finished paying off a debt he has carried a long time without telling anyone. I did not know what debt that was. I only knew, standing there with my hand closed around a key, nobody could explain, that whatever it was, it had nothing to do with me. I did not go back to the ballroom right away. The coat room smelled like wet wool and other people's perfume, and I stood there long enough for the string quartet to finish one song and start another, before I made myself move. I left my champagne glass on the shelf by the umbrella stand. I did not want to hold anything that would show if my hand started shaking. The hallway behind the reception space at Wethersfield Cove Yacht Club runs along the kitchen, narrow, carpeted in the kind of navy blue that hides everything except light. I know that hallway because I have walked it before at other events other years, when nobody paid attention to where I went because nobody was watching me at all. That used to be a comfort. Tonight, it still was. I heard my Aunt Patricia before I saw her. Her voice does not carry. Not normally, she is the kind of woman who learned early to keep her volume down at every dinner table she was ever seated at, but tonight it carried anyway, just barely, just enough to reach me from behind a service cart stacked with dessert plates. My son did not ask for this, Richard. A pause. Ice clinking somewhere close. A waiter moving past me with a tray, not looking at me, not caring that I had stopped walking in the middle of a hallway at my own father's retirement party. You decided this on your own, and then you put him on a stage in front of 200 people and let him find out the same way everyone else did. I stepped closer to the service cart, close enough to see a slice of my father through the gap between it and the wall. He had his jacket still buttoned. He always keeps his jacket buttoned when he is uncomfortable, a habit I noticed when I was maybe 9 years old and never stopped noticing since. I am only doing what should have been done 15 years ago, he said. His voice was quieter than I have ever heard it in a business context, which is to say, it did not sound like the voice he uses on earnings calls or in front of the board. It sounded like a voice with something underneath it. Something old, something he had been carrying alone long enough that saying it out loud seemed to cost him something. Patricia said something back that I did not catch the words, swallowed by the kitchen door swinging open and shut, releasing a burst of heat and the smell of seared scallops. When the door settled, my father said one more thing. "You do not know everything I owe him." I did not know who he meant. Preston was not in the hallway. Preston, as far as I understood the timeline of the evening, was still standing where my father had left him in the middle of the ballroom floor holding a glass he had not touched. 15 years ago, I was 17. I know this the way I know quarterly numbers without needing a calculator, the kind of math that happens in the back of my head before I decide to do it on purpose. 15 years ago, I was a junior at Hall High School. My mother was 2 years into treatment. Nobody outside the family knew was as serious as it was, and my father was traveling to Boston twice a month for reasons I never fully understood at the time and stopped asking about because asking never got me anywhere. 15 years ago is not a year that means anything to me. I could not place a single family event in it. I could not place a single thing my father owed anyone, let alone Preston, who would have been 19 and away at school, and about as far from this company as a person could be. I did not have time to work through it further because the cart in front of me rattled, and a waiter apologized, and by the time I looked back through the gap, my father and Patricia had moved or stopped talking, or both. I stepped back. Before either of them could round the corner and find me standing in a hallway I had no reason to be in, unless I wanted them to know I had heard something. The band changed songs again, something slower now, and through the wall I could hear my father's assistant, a young man named Corey, who has worked for him 2 years, and still calls me Ms. Davis like I might correct him, telling somebody near the bar that this had been in the works for months, not weeks. Months. I filed that away too, the way I file everything without deciding yet what it was worth. Ruth Alvarez found me by the coat check 3 minutes later. Ruth has run our claims department for 19 years since before I started, and she was the first person at that company who ever explained anything to me without making me feel like I had asked a stupid question. My first week, 22 years old, I asked her what a loss reserve actually was out loud in a meeting, and I watched 2 directors exchange a look before Ruth cut in and just told me clean and simple. No attitude about it. I have never forgotten that. It is a small thing. Small things are usually the ones you remember. She had a cocktail napkin in her hand, not a tissue. The yacht club did not have tissues lying around, and she held it out to me anyway, like it might be useful. "I am not crying," I told her. "I know," she said. "I brought it in case that changed." She did not ask what happened at the toast. She did not need to. Half the room had already reorganized itself around the new center of gravity clustering near Preston, near my father, the way a party does when everyone senses a shift in who matters and adjusts their bodies before their brains catch up. Ruth stood next to me instead, facing the same direction I was facing, which happened to be toward the glass doors that separated the hallway from the ballroom floor. Preston was still standing where I had left him. Alone, the way you are alone, in a room full of 200 people who are all deliberately not looking at you, because looking at you means acknowledging what just happened. His wine glass had not moved from chest height. His tie was straight. Everything about him looked prepared except his face, which looked like a man doing arithmetic he did not know how to finish. I have known Preston since he was 6 years old, and I was 4 since summers at my grandmother's house on the water, since a childhood where he was the cousin who cried when he lost at cards, and I was the one who taught him how to stop losing so badly. I did not in that hallway feel what I expected to feel toward him. I thought I would feel something sharp. Instead, I felt the strange Useless clarity of watching someone else get handed a problem they did not build and did not know how to hold. Ruth touched my elbow light just once. "You do not have to go back in there tonight," she said. "Nobody would blame you." "I am going back in," I told her. "I have been in this family 32 years. I am not going to leave a party through a service hallway like I did something wrong." She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant she understood I was not really answering her question. I was answering something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the party and everything to do with every room I had ever had to walk back into after somebody made it clear I was not the point of the evening. I straightened my dress. I did not check my makeup. There was no mirror, and even if there had been, I did not want to know what my face was doing. Before I pushed the door open, I ran the number again in my head. 15 years. Not my mother's diagnosis that was closer to 17 years back. Not my parents' anniversary. Not a merger. Not a single filing date I could pull from memory, and I pull filing dates from memory the way other people remember song lyrics. I pushed the door open into a wall of sound jazz and forks against china and my father's voice somewhere near the center of the room, already laughing at something a client had said already, moving on the way men like my father always move on like the last few minutes had never happened at all. Eleanor Frost intercepted me before I reached table 6. She has sat on our board for 11 years. She was in the room the year I built the coastal flood model, 24 years old, hands sweating through the clicker, while I explained why our reinsurance treaty was about to bankrupt us if nobody listened. She did not smile at me tonight the way she usually does. "That was not right what he did up there," she said low enough that only I could hear it over the band. "Whatever this is about, it did not need to happen in front of 200 people. I told her I appreciated her saying so. She held my gaze a moment longer, the kind of look older women give you when they know more than they are willing to say at a party with this many ears in the room. "Ask him about the trust sometime," she said. Then she moved off before I could ask which trust she meant, swallowed back into a cluster of guests near the bar, leaving me standing there with one more thread I could not yet tie to anything. A caterer passed with a tray of coffee cups and asked not unkindly if I was the analyst, the one who worked on the numbers side. I said I was. She said someone had mentioned I might want decaf this late, and I realized my father had told the catering staff something about me. Some small detail meant to look like care, and I could not decide if that made the evening better or worse. I took the coffee. My hand was steady taking it from her and then setting it down on the table a moment later. It was not for more than a second, just long enough that the cup rattled once against the saucer before I caught it. I sat back down at table 6. My phone was face down where I had left it, and when I turned it over there was a text from a friend outside the family, someone who did not know where I was tonight or why it mattered, asking if I wanted to get coffee this week. I did not answer it. I set the phone back down, screen dark, and looked out at the water through the tall windows at the sailboats rocking gently on their moorings, indifferent to anything happening inside this building. 15 years ago, a trust nobody had ever mentioned to me. 2 threads handed to me in the same 10 minutes by 2 different women who were not supposed to know more about my own family than I did, and no way yet to know if they led back to the same place. Monday morning, Davis Insurance Group, Pearl Street, Hartford, 7:02. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock on my monitor twice before I let myself feel anything about what I was about to read. The office is never completely empty this early. There is always Roberto running the floor buffer near the elevator bank, and there is always coffee already brewing in the break room because the machine runs on a timer that predates my employment here by a decade. Nobody else was on our floor yet. I have liked it that way for 10 years since I decided the only way anybody would take a 22-year-old seriously in this building was if I was already at my desk when they walked in. I was reviewing Friday's claim summary when Danny Ferreira knocked on my open door. Danny is 26, 3 years into compliance, the kind of young analyst who still says sorry to bother you before every question, even though I have told him 4 times he does not need to. He had a printout in his hand, the quarterly board packet draft still warm from the printer. I just wanted to flag something before it goes to legal for final review, he said. Page 14. Preston's got signing authority listed effective start of next quarter, in place of the CFO on anything under $2 million. I asked him to repeat the page number. Page 14, he said. I figured you already knew since it's dated 3 weeks ago. Everybody's been saying it's official for a while now. I thanked him. I did not let my face do anything in particular. Danny set the printout on the corner of my desk because I asked him to, and went back to his cubicle, and I closed my office door for the first time in longer than I could remember doing at 7 in the morning on a Monday. I sat down and read page 14 4 times. Board Resolution 24-19 granting interim signing authority to P. Whitfield for transactions under $2 million, effective the first day of next quarter pending formal appointment. Drafted by outside counsel. Dated 3 weeks before the party. 3 weeks. My father had raised his glass on a Saturday, like the idea had only just become real enough to say out loud in front of 200 people. But a document like this does not exist because somebody decided something over dinner the week before. Getting a resolution drafted by outside counsel routed through legal formatted into a packet that goes out 10 business days ahead of the quarterly meeting that takes weeks on its own and before any of that. Somebody has to instruct outside counsel what to draft in the first place. Before that, my father had to decide alone in a room I was never in that this was happening. I thought about the Connecticut Insurance Department notification form CID 14 required whenever a licensed entity changes an officer holding binding signing authority. I am usually the one who prepares that filing. It had not crossed my desk, which meant somebody was holding it back, waiting for a specific moment to make the whole thing public in a way nobody could quietly question, and that moment had been Saturday night in a room full of 200 witnesses, where my father could say it once and never have to explain himself to any single person alone. The last time I sat in a room and felt this exact combination of cold and steady, I was 24 years old, 8 days after a nor'easter had flooded half our coastal book along the Sound, and I was the only person in the building who had run the numbers on our reinsurance exposure and did not like what they showed. Nobody asked me to check it. I checked it anyway on my own time because the treaty renewal language looked wrong to me, and it took 11 hours across 2 nights to prove it. I walked into that boardroom with a stack of printouts my hands would not stop shaking around, and told 9 board members, most of whom had known me since I was in diapers, that the company was exposed to $11 million in claims our current treaty did not cover. Eleanor Frost was the only one who asked me a real question instead of looking at my father first to see how he wanted her to react. My father let me finish that day. He did not take the floor from me. He also never once, in the 8 years since, told a client or a colleague that the correction had come from his daughter and not from some unnamed team effort. I used to tell myself that was modesty, a family trait, the same reason he never talks about his own father running this company out of a 2-room office on Asylum Street, with 1 secretary and a single line of credit. Sitting in my closed office 8 years later, reading a resolution that erased my name from a distribution list in exchange for 4 words about somebody else carrying the company forward, modesty was not the word I reached for anymore. I am not someone who reacts to things by feeling them right away. I react by figuring out what they mean first and feeling them later, sometimes hours later, sometimes in the car, sometimes not, until I am standing at the sink with nothing left to calculate. That is not a strength I chose. It is the shape my grief was allowed to take, The year my mother was sick when somebody in the house needed to keep track of insurance forms and appointment times while everyone else fell apart. And it turned out I was good at it. Once you are good at something in a family like mine, it becomes the only thing anyone ever asks of you again. So I did not cry in my office on a Monday morning. I opened my laptop, propped the printout against my monitor, and photographed each page with my phone, flat lighting no shadow across the text. I created a folder on my personal cloud drive, not the company server, and named it Q, 3 notes, something that would mean nothing to anyone who happened to see it over my shoulder in a meeting. 4 photographs went into it. Page 14. The signature line still blank. The distribution list at the front of the packet, which did not include my name, though it had included my name on every quarterly packet for the last 6 years back to before Preston had ever set foot in this building. I checked the distribution list twice to be sure I was not imagining it. Corey's name was on it now. Corey, who has worked here 2 years and still calls me Ms. Davis. My name was gone. The anger I had carried out of the coat room 2 nights earlier was still there, but it had changed shape overnight the way anger does when you let it sit, instead of spending it right away. It was colder now, and quieter and considerably more useful, and I did not entirely trust myself around something that felt this useful before I had even had coffee. Ruth's key card beeped at the far end of the hall around 7:40. I heard her before I saw her humming something low under her breath, the way she always does on her way to the break room. She stopped in my doorway with 2 coffees, one of which she set on my desk without asking if I wanted it. "You look like someone who read something they were not supposed to see." "Yet," she said. "I did not read anything. Danny told me." Ruth's face did not change, but she closed my office door the rest of the way, with her foot, which she has never done before in 19 years of walking past this doorway. "Whatever it is," she said, "do not decide anything about it before lunch. You do your worst thinking before 9 in the morning. Always have." She left before I could ask her how she knew there was anything to decide. I drank the coffee. It was exactly the way I take it, which meant she had known that detail about me for longer than I had bothered to notice her noticing. The rest of the morning happened the way mornings happen, when half of you is somewhere else entirely. I took a 9 o'clock call with the marina ownership group out of Mystic that renews with us. Every March walked their broker through a coverage gap on umbrella liability without a single stumble, and hung up, knowing I would not be able to repeat a word of what I had just said if someone asked me 5 minutes later. I signed off on 2 claims files. I answered an email from Preston's new assistant, Katie, asking where the archived underwriting files from 2019 were kept, and typed the folder path without adding anything else, though I wanted to write 6 other sentences, and deleted every one of them before sending. I thought about the phrase Patricia had used in the hallway 15 years, and I thought about Eleanor Frost's voice telling me to ask my father about the trust, and I thought about 4 photographs sitting in a folder on my personal drive that nobody in this building knew existed. 3 separate threads arriving within the same 72 hours, and no way yet to know if any of them touched the others, or if I was simply a woman assembling a pattern out of noise, because the alternative, that none of it connected, that it was only ever this simple and this cruel, was harder to sit with. I thought about what it would mean to actually use the photographs, to send them somewhere to someone, to turn a private discovery into a public fact, the way my father had done to me on Saturday night, in front of 200 people I had known my whole life. I did not have an answer yet. Not one I trusted. Not at 7:40 in the morning on a Monday with the rest of the week still ahead of me, and my hand still flat on the closed laptop like I could keep whatever was inside it from moving on its own. At noon, I ate lunch at my desk, a sandwich from the deli on Trumbull Street I have ordered the same way for 6 years, and I let Ruth's rule hold. I did not open the folder named after nothing. I did not draft an email I would regret. I watched the clock cross 12:15, then 12:30. The way you watch a kettle you have decided not to touch until it actually screams. And somewhere in that waiting, I understood that the version of me who photographed those 4 pages at 7 in the morning had already made a decision the rest of me had not caught up to yet. I was not collecting evidence to feel better. I was collecting it because some quiet, practical part of my mind, the same part that flags a reinsurance treaty nobody asked me to check, had already decided I might need it, and that part of me is rarely wrong about what I will eventually need. Jan sua loi truok ki giao, Tuesday bigon ham he, lan jungrala, Monday cop timeline, voi part ba, vabo, Dau gach ngankat kau thuai, not on the je tuan tu jung kui tak kong, dung dash, gach cheo ellipsis chopause. I did not decide to drive to my father's house. I decided to drive home and somewhere on Farmington Avenue without choosing it exactly. I signaled left instead of right, and ended up on Mountain Road in West Hartford with the engine still running in his driveway before I understood what I was doing there. I had spent the whole day being careful. Ruth's rule had held through lunch, through the marina call, through an afternoon of pretending to review a claims file. I read the same paragraph of 4 times without absorbing a word. I had told myself I was handling this the right way, methodically, the way I handle everything, and then I got in my car at 6, and something in me that had been quiet all day simply stopped being quiet. I have done this before. Exactly once. The week after my mother's funeral, driving somewhere I had not planned to go, because sitting still with what I actually felt was worse than moving towards something, anything, even a conversation I was not ready to have. The house looked the way it always looks in early October, the 2 maples out front already turning porch light on my father's Buick parked at an angle that has annoyed me since I was old enough to notice things like that. I sat in my car for 4 full minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time the way I watch numbers when I do not trust myself to watch anything else. He answered the door in his reading glasses, a folder of something still in his hand. Surprised in the specific way people are surprised when a visit has not been announced. "Amelia, everything all right?" I told him I needed 5 minutes. He stepped back to let me in, glasses still pushed up on his forehead, and I followed him down the hall past photographs I have looked at my entire life without really seeing my parents at their wedding, me at 8 in a soccer uniform 2 sizes too big. My mother laughing at something off camera the year before she got sick. I slowed at that one without meaning to. My father noticed. He always notices when I look at that photograph, and he has never once, in 10 years, said anything about it, which is its own kind of conversation we have been having in silence since she died. His office is really just a den with a desk in it, and a half-finished model of a schooner he has been building since before I was born, rigging strung halfway up one mast and abandoned there the way a lot of things in that room have been started and left. There is a rotary phone on a side table that has not worked in decades, a gift from his own father the year Davis Insurance Group moved out of the 2-room office on Asylum Street, kept for reasons he has never explained and I have never asked about. I stood in the doorway of that room under a ceiling fan that needed dusting and felt every rehearsed sentence I had built on the drive over start to come apart. I had a version of this conversation planned in the car. It had specific words in it. 10 years, $11 million. My name on a distribution list that no longer had it. I had planned to be precise the way I am precise about everything else, to lay it out the way I would lay out a claim summary, clean, undeniable, impossible to argue with. What came out instead, standing in the doorway of his office with the schooner half-built on the shelf behind him, was not that. "Do you think this company is entirely yours to just hand to whoever you want?" He set the folder down on his desk. He took his glasses off the rest of the way. "That is exactly how it works, Amelia. I built it. I get to choose who carries it forward." I stood there for a second with my mouth still partly open around whatever sentence had been coming next, and I understood watching his face that he was not being cruel. He genuinely did not know what I meant. He thought I was talking about ownership in some abstract philosophical way. The same conversation any founder's child might have with any founder, fairness in general, legacy in general. Nothing specific, nothing with a document number attached to it. He had no idea there was a folder on my personal cloud drive named after nothing. He had no idea I had spent Monday morning photographing a board resolution with my hands steady and my stomach doing something entirely different. I could have told him. That was the moment. I could have said the words board resolution said the date said page 14 and watched his face do whatever it was going to do. I did not. Something in me, some old reflex built the year I was 17, and learned that information only has value if you keep it until you understand exactly what you are going to do with it, pulled the words back before they reached my mouth. It was not strategy. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier to tell this as though I was already 3 steps ahead of him that night, calm and calculating in his den while he fumbled through a conversation he did not know he was having. That is not what happened. What happened is I got scared of my own advantage before I even understood I had one, and I said something smaller instead. Then why wasn't I in the room, I said before I could stop myself. Not the toast. Before that. When you were deciding. He rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he does when a meeting has gone longer than he wanted. This isn't a boardroom decision, Amelia. It's a family decision. That's worse, I told him. My hand had found the edge of his desk without my noticing, and I realized I was gripping it hard enough that my knuckles had gone pale, and I made myself let go before he could see it, though I am fairly sure he already had. I will not stay to be treated like secondary staff in a company I helped build, I told him, and my voice came out lower than I meant it to, which somehow made it sound less like a threat and more like a confession. My father looked at me the way he has looked at me since I was small, whenever I cried about something he considered manageable. Not unkind, just certain he understood the situation better than I did. You're very emotional right now, he said. We can talk about this when you've had some sleep. I have never wanted to throw something in my life the way I wanted to throw something in that office at that exact sentence, with that exact tone, the tone he uses when he has decided a conversation is over, before I have decided it is over. I did not throw anything. I looked at the schooner on the shelf, half its rigging still unstrung, a project he has been not quite finishing for 30 years, and I said I would let myself out. I walked back down the hall the way I had come past the wedding photo, past the soccer uniform, and stopped again in front of my mother laughing at something none of us would ever know the punchline to. My father had followed me as far as the office doorway, and no further, which is its own kind of answer. I did not turn around to see his face. I have wondered since whether that was cowardice too, or whether some part of me already understood I would need to remember his face as it was in that moment for something later, and did not trust myself to look at it straight on and stay as calm as I needed to stay. I did not slam the door. I want that on the record mostly for myself. I have replayed that drive home so many times since, and in every version I want to have slammed something, and in every actual memory my hand closed around the doorknob and pulled it shut with more care than the moment deserved, because some part of me was still protecting a house I no longer fully trusted. In the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel and the engine off for longer than I should have, watching the porch light through the windshield, watching for a shadow that would mean he had come to the window. He did not come to the window. I picked up my phone to call Ruth. I had the message half composed in my head already. Something about needing tomorrow off, something vague enough not to require an explanation. My thumb was over her name in my recent calls when I stopped and scrolled instead and called Gordon Hale. He picked up on the third ring background noise behind him, a television, a life, happening somewhere that had nothing to do with mine. Amelia, bit late for a Monday. I asked him one question. Has my father said anything to you lately about refinancing the Pearl Street building? There was a pause on his end that told me more than whatever he was about to say next. A pause with weight in it. A pause that meant yes, and something else. Something he was deciding how much of to tell me on a Monday at 9:30 at night with a television playing behind him. Amelia, I think we should talk about this in person, not on the phone. I hung up before he could finish whatever he meant to say after that. I do not entirely know why. Some part of me did not want to hear it that night, not with my father's porch light still visible in my rearview mirror, and my hands still not quite steady on the wheel. I sat in the driveway of a house I no longer felt fully welcome in, engine, still off phone screen, going dark in my lap, and let the porch light burn a while longer before I finally turned the key. I thought about what I had almost said in that office, the sentence with the board resolution in it, the sentence that would have ended the evening completely differently. I did not know yet, sitting there in the dark, whether holding it back had been wisdom or cowardice, and I suspected it would be a while before I trusted my own answer to that question. What I did know, pulling out of the driveway without looking back at the house, was that Gordon Hale's pause on the phone had lasted exactly as long as it takes a person to decide how much truth someone can handle on a Monday night, and that I intended to find out the rest of it, whether he was ready to give it to me or not. I came in on time Tuesday morning, not because I had forgotten what I said in my father's office the night before, and not because I had decided I was wrong to say it. I came in because walking away right then would have meant leaving behind everything I was quietly holding on to, and I had not used any of it yet. You do not abandon a position before you know what it is worth. The building on Pearl Street runs cold in the mornings, no matter the season. Something about the HVAC system nobody has ever fixed in the decade I have worked there, and the fluorescent lights over the underwriting floor buzz faintly at a pitch. I stopped noticing years ago and noticed again that morning for no reason I could explain. I badged in at 7:15. The lobby guard Marcus said good morning the same way he always does. Nothing about the building had changed. Everything about it had. Preston's new office sits at the corner of the fourth floor, glass walls on two sides, the one my father used to keep as a spare conference room before somebody decided it needed a name on the door. The name was already there. Preston Whitfield engraved plate, the kind that takes at least 4 business days to order through the vendor we use, which meant somebody had ordered it before Saturday, the same way somebody had drafted a board resolution 3 weeks before Saturday. I stood in the hallway looking at it longer than I meant to. A young woman I did not recognize was arranging a desk plant just inside the door, a small monstera in a white ceramic pot. "You must be Amelia," she said, straightening up. "I'm Katie. I'm working with Preston now." I told her it was nice to meet her. I meant it mostly the way you can mean something and still feel it land somewhere hollow. She had a stack of client files on her desk that I recognized from the spine labels before I could stop myself from recognizing them. 7 years of relationships I had built, one renewal call at a time, one claims resolution at a time, moved to a desk that had not existed the week before. Preston came out of his office while I was still standing there, tie already loosened, though it was not yet 7:30, a coffee in each hand, like he had meant to bring one for someone and forgotten who. He saw me and stopped in the doorway, the way you stop when you walk into a room and realize you are underdressed for whatever is actually happening in it. "Amelia, I didn't know you'd be in this early." "I am always in this early," I told him. It was not unkind exactly, but I did not soften it either. "Right," he said. "Of course." He looked down at the 2 coffees in his hands as though he had only just noticed he was holding them, and did not offer either one, and I did not ask. Something in his face, standing there in a corner office he had occupied for less than 3 days, looked less like a man enjoying a win, and more like a man standing in a house he had been handed the keys to without ever seeing the mortgage. I went to log into the shared drive folder where those files lived digitally out of habit more than need, and the system returned an error. Access restricted. Contact your administrator for permission. I sat there looking at that message for longer than it deserved. I am the administrator for most of what I touch in that building. I had never once in 10 years needed to ask a permission to see my own work. My office door still had my name on it when I reached it. That was almost worse than if it had not. Amelia Davis Sr., financial analyst, the same plate that had been there since my last promotion 6 years ago, a title that had not moved, even as the actual work under it had grown into something closer to director than analyst, a gap between title and function my father had always promised to fix eventually, in the next cycle once things settled down. Things had never settled down. I understood standing in front of that unchanged plate on an otherwise completely changed floor that they never would have on their own without something forcing the question. I ran a finger along the bottom edge of the plate, the way you check a thing is still real, and thought about the two women who had handed me new information in the same 3 days, Patricia's 15 years and Eleanor's trust, and how neither of them had anything to do with a title that had not changed in 6 years. And how I still could not make the pieces sit next to each other in any order that made sense. I found Ruth in the small kitchen on our floor around 8, filling her mug from the machine that makes coffee taste faintly of the cardboard box it came from. She did not ask how I was. She has never been a woman who asks questions she already knows the answer to. "They are not firing you," she said low enough that it stayed between us. "They are making you disappear slowly. That is worse. It takes longer and nobody has to feel responsible for any single moment of it." I asked her how she knew that was what this was. "I have worked in insurance 31 years, she said. "I have watched this exact playbook run on 4 different people who were not family, and every time it ended the same way. Nobody gets fired. They just get smaller and smaller until leaving looks like their own idea." "Whose files did they give him?" she asked, though I think she already knew. "Beacon Hill Marine, the Whitcomb Family Trust, the Fairfield County Contractors Group," I said. "Every account I built myself, starting with the first one when I was 23, and nobody else wanted to drive to Mystic for a client worth $11,000 a year." Ruth's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible sign she gave that any of this cost her something too. She has known me since I was that 23-year-old driving to Mystic. She does not perform her feelings, but she does not hide them completely from me either. I carried that sentence back to my desk with my own cup of the cardboard coffee, and I thought about every access restriction, every meeting I had not been invited to since Saturday. Every small procedural erasure that had happened in exactly the right order to look like nothing at all, if you examined any single piece of it alone. At 11, I noticed my calendar had quietly dropped the Wednesday underwriting review, a standing meeting I had run every week for 4 years, the invite simply gone from my week rather than canceled, no notification, no explanation, the kind of removal that only shows up if you happen to look for something that used to be there. I checked twice to be sure I was not imagining it, the same way I had checked the distribution list on Monday. I was not imagining it. Ruth was right. I had seen this pattern myself from the other side twice, both times, with employees who had underperformed and needed a legal defensible path out that did not involve the company writing a check. I knew the shape of it because I had reviewed the paperwork for it. What I had never done was recognize it happening to me while it was happening, and there is a particular kind of cold that comes from realizing the thing being done to you is not personal cruelty at all. It is a procedure. Someone is running a procedure on their own daughter cleanly, defensibly, the exact way you would run it on a stranger, and somehow that is worse than if it had been cruelty, because cruelty at least requires someone to feel something while they do it. An email came in around 10, subject line vague enough that I almost skipped it, from a recruiter at a firm in Boston I had spoken with once months ago at an industry conference and never followed up with. A conversation, if you're open to it. Nothing more specific than that. I read the first line twice and did not read the rest. I was not ready for whatever the rest of it said. I did not delete it. I want to be honest about that because deleting it would have been the easier story to tell myself, the version where I was completely certain about staying and fighting for what I had built. Instead, I dragged it into a folder I created on the spot and named, later the only folder on my entire desktop I do not process the same day. It appears the only place I let something sit without deciding what to do with it right away. I looked at that folder for a moment after I made it. One email inside it. It sat there next to a folder named Q, 3 notes, that already held 4 photographs. Nobody in this building knew existed 2 folders on the same desktop, each one a version of me I had not decided whether to become. I closed the laptop screen halfway, not all the way, and went back to the claims file I had been reviewing since 7:15, the fluorescent light over my desk buzzing at that same pitch, my old title on my old door, my client files on somebody else's desk. Somewhere down the hall, Preston's new nameplate caught the light every time the elevator doors opened and closed, a small flash of engraved brass that had taken 4 business days to order. 3 weeks before anyone had bothered to tell me anything at all. I stayed until 6:30 later than I needed to, mostly because leaving on time felt like conceding something I was not ready to concede. Roberto was running the buffer again when I passed the lobby, same as every night, and he said goodnight the same way he always does, and I realized walking to my car that the building itself had not changed 1 degree in temperature or light or sound. Only the people inside it had rearranged themselves around a decision made 3 weeks before anyone asked what I thought. I drove home with the radio off, replaying Ruth's sentence the entire way, "They are making you disappear slowly," and I understood somewhere around the exit for West Hartford that I did not intend to make it easy for them. Gordon Hale called at 2:40 on Wednesday afternoon, and I knew from the first word that it was not a routine call. Gordon has represented this family for 22 years. I have heard him deliver bad news in a dozen different registers, calm through a lawsuit, calm through my mother's estate paperwork, calm the night 3 years ago when he sat across from me at his own kitchen table and slid a stack of documents toward me with a pen already uncapped. This was not that calm. This was careful in a way that meant he had rehearsed what he was about to say before he dialed. I stepped out of the bullpen and into the small conference room on the 4th floor that nobody uses anymore, the one with a whiteboard still covered in someone's abandoned brainstorm from a meeting months ago, arrows pointing at circles, pointing at nothing. I closed the door. "I need to talk to you about the Pearl Street building," he said, "before anyone else does." I told him I was listening. "The refinance your father is pushing through to fund Preston's transition, it requires a full title search. Standard procedure for any commercial mortgage over a certain size. The bank's closing attorney will pull ownership records going back to 1961 if they have to." How long, I asked him. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. They've already engaged a title company out of Hartford, one I've worked with before, and I would guess they run the search within the next 10 business days, though the results won't cross anyone's desk officially until closer to closing. Once it does, it becomes part of the file. Anyone reviewing the loan package sees it. Your father, the bank's counsel. Eventually, if it ever becomes relevant in any dispute, a judge. I asked him whether there was any way to remove my name quietly before that happened. Some quitclaim in reverse, something clean enough that nobody would need to ask why it had been there in the first place. "There is," he said. "I could draft it in an afternoon if you asked me to. But Amelia, I want to be honest with you the way I was honest with you 3 years ago. I don't think that's the paper you actually want me to draft. I think you want me to draft it because it feels safer than the alternative, and I have known you long enough to know those are not the same thing. I did not say anything right away. I did not need him to explain what a title search would find, because I have known what a title search would find for 3 years, since the night I sat at his kitchen table in Simsbury, with my mother's inheritance check already deposited and a quit-claim deed in front of me that made me, for the first time in my life, a legal owner of something that mattered. I remember that night in pieces the way you remember anything that happened fast and mattered more than you understood at the time. My father had called me on a Thursday, his voice doing something I had never heard it do before, thin and fast, telling me the reinsurance renewal had fallen through, that the bank needed additional collateral within the week, or the whole treaty would lapse before the next named storm season, and that he did not know what he was going to do. I drove to Gordon's house that same night, not my father's, because Gordon was the one who called me back within 20 minutes of my father hanging up, and Gordon was the one who had already run the numbers and knew exactly what a woman with a maturing trust and a clean credit history could accomplish that a company running short on liquidity could not. I signed 4 documents that night. Gordon explained each one before I signed it slowly. The way you explain something to someone who is about to make a decision you want them to be certain about. My father was not in the room. My father, I found out much later, had asked not to be in the room because some part of him could not watch his daughter's name go onto a piece of paper his own name should have been carrying alone. You know better than anyone your name is still on that deed, Gordon said. The question was never going to be whether it gets discovered. It was always going to be who discovers it first and how you want them to find out. I sat down in one of the mismatched chairs somebody had dragged into that conference room years ago and never returned to wherever it came from. Through the window, I could see the gold dome of the state capitol a few blocks away, the same view I have had from various windows in this building for 10 years, ordinary, unbothered by anything happening on my end of the phone line. Nobody has said it out loud to me since that night I told him. Not once. Not you, not me, not anybody. I know, he said. I was there. I drew up the paperwork myself, and I have kept it filed exactly the way your father asked me to keep it filed quietly, and I have not raised it with him once in 3 years, because it was never my place to raise it unless one of you asked me to. But Amelia, the bank is not going to keep it quiet. A title search is a matter of public record the moment it is run. Anyone with access to the county clerk's office can see what it shows. I thought about my father standing at that podium on Saturday Night Glass, raised 4 words about somebody else carrying the company forward. No idea that the building his new heir would need to inherit still had my signature on the deed, like a hand he had forgotten, was still holding on. I thought about Patricia's 15 years in the hallway, and Eleanor's trust by the bar, 2 threads I still had not managed to fit anywhere near this one, and for a moment. Sitting in a borrowed chair under fluorescent light with a dead whiteboard behind me, I let myself wonder whether every thread I had been handed in the last 5 days was actually the same thread cut into pieces and given to me by different people who each only knew their own section of it. My throat did something I did not expect it to do, tightening enough that I had to stop and breathe once before I trusted my own voice again. Gordon, to his credit, waited. He has always been good at waiting, better than my father, better than almost anyone I know. Does he know you're calling me? I asked. The pause on Gordon's end lasted long enough that I could hear faintly a television somewhere behind him, the same background noise from Monday night, the same life happening in a room I was not part of. No, he said. He does not know I'm calling, and I think you should be the one who decides when he finds out. I did not answer him right away. Outside the conference room window, a delivery truck idled on Pearl Street with its hazards blinking, and somewhere below me, the ordinary business of Wednesday afternoon kept moving. Claims, processed calls returned a company running exactly the way it had run yesterday and the day before that. Unaware that somewhere on the fourth floor, a decision that had been sitting quiet for 3 years was about to stop being quiet, whether I chose the timing or the bank did it for me. "Take a few days," Gordon said before he let me go. "Not weeks. I don't have weeks to give you, and neither do you, but a few days won't collapse anything. Just don't let this be a decision that happens to you. Whatever you decide, decide it on purpose." I told him I would call him Friday. I did not know yet what I would tell him when I did. I sat alone in that borrowed conference room for a while after he hung up, looking at the arrows on the whiteboard that pointed at circles that led nowhere. Somebody else's abandoned plan from a meeting I had never attended, and I thought about how much of the last 5 days had felt exactly like that. Arrows pointing at things I could not yet name, drawn by people who knew more of the picture than I did, and had decided each for their own reasons to hand me one piece at a time instead of the whole thing at once. When I finally walked back to my desk, Ruth was at the copier down the hall, and she caught my face for half a second before I could arrange it into something more ordinary. She did not ask. She has known me long enough to know when a question would cost more than it was worth to either of us in the middle of an open floor with too many ears nearby. She just held my gaze a beat longer than usual, the way you check on someone from across a room without making a scene of it, and went back to her copies. I sat down at my desk and opened the folder named Q3 Notes out of habit, then closed it again without looking at the photographs inside. 3 years of quiet had just become a countdown with a number attached to it, 10 business days until a search was run 3 or 4 weeks, until it crossed a desk that was not mine. And somewhere inside that window I was going to have to decide whether the woman who signed her name to a piece of paper to save her father's company was also willing to be the woman whose name on that same paper might eventually be the only thing standing between him and losing it a second time. The restaurant sits right on Long Wharf Drive in New Haven. Glass windows facing the harbor, the kind of place where the seafood is good enough that nobody complains about paying $12 for a cup of chowder. Salt and diesel from the working docks outside the low hum of a ferry engine idling somewhere past the breakwater silverware against china, inside warm enough to fog the glass at the edges. Beacon Hill Marine Holdings has been a client for 7 years. I picked this restaurant myself the first year because Tom Kessler mentioned once that he liked watching the ferry come in while he ate, and I never forgot it, and every renewal dinner since has happened at the same table by the same window, a small continuity nobody had asked me to maintain, and nobody had told Preston about. I remember the first year clearly, 25 years old, terrified, sent to that dinner alone because nobody senior wanted to drive to New Haven on a Tuesday for a client worth less than the ones downtown. Tom Kessler had looked at me across the table that first night, visibly deciding whether a company had sent him someone serious or someone junior enough not to matter, and I had spent the entire appetizer course proving I was the former before he relaxed enough to order dessert. He has told that story back to me at least 4 times, since always fondly, always ending the same way. You were the only one who came prepared. I never forgot that either. Their reinsurance treaty renews in 5 days. If the paperwork does not close by Monday, Beacon Hill Marine loses coverage on 11 vessels and a shipyard worth more than any single asset our company insures outside of the Pearl Street building itself. This dinner exists because contracts this size do not renew over email. They renew over a table with a handshake at the end of it, the way business in Connecticut has worked since before any of us were born. Preston wore a suit that fit him better than it should have for a man who had never sat through a treaty renewal before. My father sat at the far end of the table, mostly quiet the way he gets at client dinners when he wants to watch how a deal unfolds without steering it. I sat 2 seats down from Preston, technically there, to observe a word my father had used on the calendar invite that made me want to throw the invite itself into the harbor. Tom Kessler ordered the same thing he orders every year, the swordfish, and asked halfway through the appetizers about the structured layer coverage on the shipyard's excess policy, whether the attachment point was moving given the claims activity up and down the coast this year. Preston opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. He said something about how the team was still finalizing the modeling, which was not technically a lie, but it was also not an answer. And Tom Kessler is not a man who has built a shipping business over 30 years by accepting non-answers dressed up as diplomacy. He looked past Preston down the table and found me. Amelia. You did the modeling on this account for how long? 6 years now. 7, I told him. What's the attachment point looking like? I told him. 2,400,000 up from 2.1 the prior year, driven by the loss activity along the Gulf this season, more than anything specific to his book, and I walked him through why the increase was smaller than it could have been given market conditions, because his loss history over 7 years had earned him a better rate than a new client would get walking in cold this year. It took under 2 minutes. I did not consult a single note. Tom nodded twice. Satisfied in this specific way, a longtime client is satisfied when the numbers make sense and the person delivering them clearly understands what is underneath them. He followed up with a second question anyway, about whether the quota share on the smaller vessels would move in tandem, and I told him it would not, that we had structured those 2 pieces to move independently, 3 renewals ago specifically. So a bad season on the large fleet would not drag up his rates on the tenders and skiffs. He barely used a decision I had made myself back when nobody senior was paying close enough attention to overrule it. Tom laughed at that, a short, real laugh. That's the kind of thing you only know if you built it, he said. Preston did not say anything for a moment after that. He picked up his water glass, put it down without drinking from it, and I watched something pass across his face that was not quite embarrassment and not quite gratitude. Something closer to a man recalculating in real time exactly how much he did not yet know about the desk he now sat behind. Neither did my father. That's what I like about working with you people, Tom said, cutting into his swordfish. Somebody always actually knows the answer. The rest of the dinner moved the way these dinners are supposed to move, easier after that. Tom, telling a story about a nor'easter that nearly took out half his fleet a decade ago. 3 boats dragged clean off their moorings and one found 2 days later, beached up near Sachem Head. My father laughing at the right places because he had heard this story at least 3 times before and still gave it the reaction it deserved. Preston nodding along a beat too late each time, still recovering. I answered 2 more technical questions before dessert, both smaller, both quick. Nobody asked me to. I did it because letting the silence sit there felt worse than filling it, and because some old habit in me still could not watch a client walk away unsatisfied even when the account technically belonged to someone else's desk now. My father caught my eye once near the end of the meal over the check Tom insisted on splitting, though we both knew our firm would cover it. I could not read his face. It was not pride exactly, and it was not the relief I had seen at the yacht club either. It was something more careful than either of those, a man doing arithmetic of his own that he was not ready to share the results of. Outside, while Preston went to bring the car around, my father stood beside me on the sidewalk facing the harbor, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something about it, the attachment point, the 7 years, any of it. What he said instead was that the swordfish here had gotten better since the new chef came on. I told him it had. That was the entire conversation. In the car afterward, Preston thanked me in the parking lot, quiet, genuine in a way I had not expected. I told him it was fine. It was not entirely fine, but it was not his fault either, not really, and I did not have the energy that night to sort out exactly whose fault it was. I drove home along I-95 with the harbor lights behind me, and somewhere around the exit for Brantford I made a decision I had been circling for days without landing on it. I was not going to do that again. Not the specific act of answering a technical question in a pinch, because I would probably do that again within the month, some habit that deep does not switch off on command. What I was not going to do again was pretend it cost me nothing. Every time I stepped in to save an account I no longer officially owned, I was quietly proving my father's plan could work without ever having to say a word out loud about whether it should. I was without meaning to doing exactly what Ruth had warned me about in the kitchen, making it easier for the company to run without needing to say my name. The radio played something I did not register. Somewhere past the tolls, I thought about Tom Kessler's face when he asked for me by name instead of accepting Preston's answer, and I understood that the moment had felt good briefly in a way I did not entirely trust. It had felt like being seen. It had also, if I was honest with myself in the particular way I try to be honest with myself, on long drives with the radio down low, been one more data point in a pattern I could not keep participating in, and also claim to be angry about. You cannot resent a house for standing on a foundation you keep quietly repairing for free. At home, laptop open on the kitchen counter, I opened the folder named Later. One email still sitting inside it, unread past the first line since Tuesday. I clicked it open again, and this time I read the whole first paragraph. A recruiter named Monica Reyes writing on behalf of a firm in Boston, mentioning a director-level position overseeing catastrophe modeling for a portfolio twice the size of anything I managed at Davis salary range, redacted pending a call. Availability this week if I was interested. I read it twice. I did not reply. I did not close the folder either. I left it open on the counter while I made tea, the cursor blinking in an empty reply field I had not asked for and had not yet decided whether I wanted, and somewhere underneath the part of me still deciding a smaller, colder part had already started drafting a response. It had not shown the rest of me yet. The fifth-floor boardroom has floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall, looking down over Bushnell Park. The carousel roof just visible past the trees, even in October when nothing is running. I have sat in that room for board meetings since I was 24 years old, first as the person called in to answer a single technical question and dismissed later as someone who stayed for the whole meeting without anyone questioning why. Wednesday's quarterly meeting was the first time in 6 years I sat there without a single line on the agenda that had my name attached to it. I sat in the row of chairs along the back wall, the seats reserved for staff who might be needed but were not board members, a row I had not occupied since I was 23. Ruth sat 2 seats down from me, arms crossed, watching Preston shuffle his slide clicker with the particular stillness of a woman deciding whether to intervene. Preston presented the claim summary. It is customary for whoever holds interim signing authority to walk the board through the quarter, a formality more than anything since the numbers speak for themselves, if you know how to read them. Preston did not know how to read them. He got through the first 2 slides, fine loss ratios, premium growth, the kind of top-line numbers anyone can memorize the night before. Then Frank Wozniak, our oldest board member, 81 years old and sharper than most people half his age, asked a simple follow-up about the reserve adequacy on the coastal book, and Preston's answer wandered somewhere that had nothing to do with the question, technically accurate sentences arranged in an order that meant nothing. Frank looked at my father. My father looked at his own folded hands. Eleanor Frost has sat on this board for 11 years. She was there the year I built the flood model. She was there for every quarterly meeting since, and she does not raise her voice ever, which is exactly why the room went quiet the moment she spoke. Who in this room actually reads the claims data every quarter, she said, if not Amelia Davis? Nobody answered right away. My father sat at the head of the table with his hands folded in a way I have learned means he is deciding how much silence he can afford before it becomes its own answer. Preston looked down at his slides like they might rearrange themselves into something more useful if he stared hard enough. I don't see her on this agenda, Eleanor continued, and I would like someone to explain to me why the person who has run this company's risk analysis for a decade is sitting in the back of the room instead of at this table. My father cleared his throat and said something about transition periods, about Preston building his own command of the material, about how these things take time. It was not a real answer, and everyone in that room knew it was not a real answer, including the person giving it. Eleanor did not press further. She did not need to. She had said what she came to say. And she let it sit in the room the rest of the meeting like a stone dropped into still water that nobody bothered to pretend hadn't rippled. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Board members filed out in twos and threes, the ordinary after-meeting murmur, somebody mentioning lunch plans, somebody else asking Frank about his grandson's baseball season, the carpet swallowing footsteps the way carpet in old buildings does. Eleanor caught my eye on her way past the back row, said nothing, only nodded once, a small acknowledgement that cost her nothing and meant more to me than she probably understood. My father caught my arm gently as I passed him in the doorway and asked me to wait a moment, and by the time the last board member had disappeared into the elevator bank, it was just the two of us in that long fifth-floor hallway, afternoon light, coming sideways through the windows, dust visible in it, the way dust only becomes visible in old buildings at certain hours. Nobody else on the floor to hear whatever came next. "You think I'm doing this because you're not good enough," he said. It was not a question. I did not answer him. I did not entirely trust what would come out if I opened my mouth. Eleanor said what half that room has been thinking for months. He went on and did not look at me while he said it, looking instead at some point on the carpet between us. "I heard about it before the meeting ended. Do you know what that felt like, hearing my own board say your name like an accusation against me?" "That is not what she was doing," I said, and my voice came out sharper than I meant it to, sharp enough that it surprised both of us. "She was doing her job. Somebody on that board has to. I am doing this because you are too good to be stuck here for the rest of your life," he said, the way I got stuck. His voice cracked slightly on the word stuck. Both times he said it, and I realized, standing there in that hallway, that I had never once in 32 years heard my father describe his own life at this company as anything other than a legacy he was proud to carry. I had never heard the word stuck come out of his mouth in relation to himself. I did not know what to do with it standing there, and something in my chest that had been tight and controlled since Saturday night finally slipped. Just slightly, just enough that my eyes burned, and I had to look away from him toward the window instead of trusting my own face. "That is not your decision to make for me," I said, quieter now, the anger gone strange and thin. "You do not get to decide I am too good for my own life and then take it away from me as a gift." For a moment, neither of us said anything at all. Then his eyes moved. Just for half a second, involuntary, the kind of glance a person makes without deciding to make it, toward the far end of the hallway, toward a corner office with no name on the door anymore. Glass dark filing boxes stacked visible through the window where a desk used to be. I know that office. I have walked past it 1,000 times without ever asking who used to sit there. Because by the time I started working here, it had already become the place where old files went to be forgotten. I had always assumed it belonged to nobody in particular. An accident of office space, nobody had bothered to reassign the kind of forgotten room every old building accumulates. My father's eyes came back to me before I could ask him anything about it. He straightened his jacket the way he does when a conversation is closing, whether or not it is finished, and told me he had a call in 10 minutes, and walked toward his own office without waiting to see whether I had anything left to say. I stood alone in that hallway for a while after he left, looking down its length at the dark glass of that empty corner office, at the boxes stacked where a desk used to be, at a room that had clearly belonged to someone once. I walked the length of the hall toward it, slower than I meant to, and stopped in front of the glass. Through the dust on the pane, I could make out on one of the file boxes closest to the window a strip of masking tape gone yellow with age, and on it, in handwriting too faded to be recent, a single name: Patricia W. I did not go in. The door was locked, and even if it had not been, I was not ready that afternoon to open it. I stood there long enough that Ruth found me on her way back from the copier and stopped beside me without asking what I was looking at, the way she does when she already half knows. "That used to be your aunt's office," she said. "Before your time. Before mine even, almost. Nobody talks about it." I asked her why not. Ruth was quiet a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was deciding how much of something old belonged to her to tell and how much belonged to somebody else. "Ask your father," she said finally, "or don't. Some doors in this building have stayed shut a long time for reasons that were never really about the door." I understood two things standing there that I had not understood walking in. The first was that everything my father had just told me was probably true, at least partly. The way most of what my father says to me turns out to be partly true, and never the whole shape of it. The second was that whatever the whole shape of it actually was, it lived behind that dark glass at the end of the hallway under a strip of yellowed tape with my aunt's name on it. And he had just shown me exactly where to look, without meaning to show me anything at all. The email landed in my inbox at 4:50 on Thursday afternoon, the day after the board meeting, when most of the fourth floor had already cleared out for the evening, and the only sounds left were the HVAC cycling and somebody's phone ringing unanswered 2 rows over. The overhead lights on the far side of the floor had already switched to their motion sensor dim setting the way they do after 6, and my own desk sat in the last lit section of an otherwise darkening building. Subject line: RE Equity Restructuring Draft Term Sheet. I was not supposed to receive it. I understood that within the first 2 lines, the way you understand a wrong number is a wrong number, before you have even finished saying hello. It was between our CFO Walsh and an outside attorney named Bradford Shaw, whose name I did not recognize, and it had been CC'd to a distribution alias, All Risk Leadership, that I have technically remained on since a reorganization 4 years ago, even though nobody has used that alias to include me in anything meaningful since Saturday. Somebody had not thought to remove me from it. Somebody had been careless in exactly the way that hands a person the one piece of paper they were never supposed to see. The email discussed in the flat procedural language lawyers use when they want a plan to sound smaller than it is a proposed restructuring of minority equity positions in the operating company ahead of the leadership transition. My position was named specifically. 9.4% held since my grandfather's estate distribution 11 years ago, the only piece of this company that has ever technically belonged to me on paper rather than simply been done by me. I was 21 when my grandfather died, still in college, and I remember almost nothing about the funeral except that it rained and that my father did not cry once, not visibly, not even at the graveside, and that 3 months later a letter came from Gordon's office informing me I had been left a small equity stake in the company, alongside my father's much larger one, a gesture my grandfather had apparently insisted on over my father's objections, according to Gordon. Though nobody ever explained to me exactly what those objections had been. I had always assumed it was ordinary father-son friction about spoiling a grandchild. Sitting at my desk 11 years later reading an email that treated that same stake as an inconvenience to be quietly engineered away, I found myself wondering for the first time whether my grandfather had understood something about his own son that I had spent a decade refusing to see clearly myself. Bradford Shaw's email outlined 3 possible mechanisms for reducing that position through a new issuance of shares to fund Preston's buy-in, each one technically legal, each one requiring nothing from me but my absence from the conversation deciding it. The cleanest option, he wrote, would be a targeted dilution round, timed to close alongside the building refinance. Bundling both transactions under a single closing date so the paperwork moved as one clean package rather than 2 separate fights. I read that sentence twice. 2 transactions, 1 closing date, exactly the kind of efficient, bloodless planning I would have admired if I had seen it applied to any company that was not my own. I read it 3 times. My hand did not move toward the keyboard. I sat with it open on the screen, the cursor blinking somewhere in the body of Bradford Shaw's second paragraph, and I understood with the same cold clarity I had felt reading page 14 the previous Monday exactly what I was looking at. This was a card. A real one, the first one I could play immediately today. By simply forwarding this email to Eleanor Frost or to any reporter at the Hartford Courant business desk who covers family-owned insurers and watching what happened to a public company's governance story when it became clear a minority shareholder was being diluted out without notice or consent. I did not do that either. I sat with the email open and thought instead about the other card, the one nobody outside Gordon and me knew existed, the one worth considerably more than 9.4% of an operating company that was itself worth considerably less than the building it operated out of. A few percentage points of equity was real leverage. It was not enough leverage. I have spent 10 years learning to tell the difference between a number that feels satisfying to use and a number that actually moves the outcome you want. And this email, infuriating as it was the former. I thought about what would happen if I used it anyway out of pure anger, the way I had almost used the deed in my father's office the week before. A scandal about minority shareholder dilution might embarrass Walsh. It might cost Bradford Shaw a client. It would not stop the building refinance, and it would not put my name back on a single distribution list, and it would very likely burn the one piece of leverage I actually had before I understood how to use it correctly. Ruth's rule again, though, she had never said it about this specific email. Do not decide anything before you understand what it actually costs you to decide it. I closed it without replying, without forwarding it, without doing anything that would tell Walsh or Bradford Shaw or my father that I had ever seen it at all. I did not call Gordon. I thought about it, phone in my hand for a moment, his name sitting there in my recent calls under Monday night's unfinished conversation, and I put the phone back down. There was nothing new to tell him. The equity dilution was smaller than what he and I were already circling, and mixing the 2 threads together felt in that moment like handing someone a reason to solve the whole problem with one clean gesture instead of the 2 separate reckonings I was beginning to understand this actually required. Instead, I opened the folder named Later. The Boston email was still there, still unread past its first paragraph since Wednesday. This time, I read the whole thing, top to bottom, no line skipped. Monica Reyes had written more than I remembered, a full second page about the role itself. Catastrophe modeling across a portfolio spanning 6 states, direct reporting line to the chief risk officer, no family name attached to any decision I would ever make there. No distribution list I would need to check myself against to know whether I still existed inside it. The salary range, unredacted this time, sat near the bottom of the page, a number comfortably higher than what I currently made, though by that point in the evening the number itself felt almost beside the point. What I kept returning to was a single line near the middle of the email. Something about the firm valuing analysts who had proven themselves capable of independent judgment under pressure, ordinary corporate language that would have meant nothing to me a week ago, and now read like it had been written for exactly the version of myself sitting in this chair. I opened a reply. I typed 4 sentences, short ones, the kind I write when I already know exactly what I am trying to say and do not need to draft around it. I read them back once. Thank you for your patience. I would like to schedule a call next week to learn more about the role. I am currently navigating some transitions at my current company that make timing important to discuss directly. I am very interested. My cursor sat blinking after the final period for a long time. I did not send it. I did not delete it either. I sat there in an empty office with the HVAC cycling, and somebody's phone still ringing unanswered 2 rows over one hand, resting near the keyboard close enough to send 4 sentences that would change the shape of everything, and I let it sit there, instead, unsent. Exactly the way I had let a folder named Q3 Notes sit unopened for 3 days, when I was not yet ready to decide what kind of person I was going to let myself become. Neither my father nor Preston had come by my desk once since yesterday's board meeting. I did not know if that was shame or strategy or simply the ordinary business of a company still running around a fight nobody wanted to name out loud. Somewhere down the hall, past the darkened cubicles and the dead whiteboard in the conference room, I no longer thought of as neutral territory. A strip of yellowed tape sat on a file box behind locked glass with my aunt's name on it. And a countdown Gordon had started on Wednesday kept moving whether or not I had decided anything at all. I turned off my monitor before I left the reply to Monica Reyes, still sitting in my drafts folder unsent, waiting for a version of me who had not yet finished deciding which of my 2 cards she was actually holding. I had told Gordon I would call him Friday that first week, and I had briefly a short call that gave me nothing new because the title company had not finished its search yet. We had agreed to talk again once there was something real to discuss. Now there was. It was Friday again, more than a week later, and some part of me needed to go down to that basement first before I made whatever decision I was going to make on the phone with him. Because I have never once in my life made an important decision without first putting my hands on whatever physical thing the decision was actually about. The archive room sits in the basement of the Davis building past the old boiler room nobody has used since the building converted to gas heat in the 90s, behind a door with a lock that still takes the same brass key I have carried in my coat pocket since the night of the party. I went down there that Friday afternoon not to look for proof I owned a piece of that building. I have known that for 3 years. I went down there because the title search results were due any day now. And some part of me needed to touch the actual paper again before it stopped being a private fact and became a public one. The stairwell down to the basement is narrower than the rest of the building, poured concrete steps worn smooth in the center from 80 years of use, and the temperature drops noticeably somewhere around the 4th step, the particular damp cold of a space that has never quite been renovated along with everything above it. I passed the old boiler cold and disconnected, wrapped in insulation gone gray with age, and unlocked the archive door with a key that still turned stiff in a lock. Nobody oils. The fluorescent tube over the 2nd row flickers has flickered for as long as I can remember, a habit of this room nobody has ever bothered to fix because nobody spends enough time down here to complain about it. The air smells the way old paper always smells, dust and something faintly like a library book, left too long in a damp basement, and my footsteps on the concrete floor sounded louder than they should have in a room this small. I found the folder exactly where I remembered it. 3rd cabinet, 2nd drawer, a manila file labeled in Gordon's own handwriting, property. 14 Pearl Street, Davis Family Trust, the edges gone soft from handling. I pulled the quitclaim deed out first, the one with both our signatures, mine still slightly unsteady in the last line, where I had signed it 3 years ago, with my hand shaking more than I wanted anyone in that kitchen in Simsbury to see. I had read that page 100 times since. In moments exactly like this one, when I needed to remind myself that something in my life had a signature on it that could not simply be reassigned by a board resolution or an outside attorney's clean paragraph. I was not looking for anything new on it. Behind it, clipped with a rusted paperclip that had left a small orange stain on the paper beneath it, was something I had never seen. A single sheet, my mother's handwriting unmistakable even after 10 years. The particular way she crossed her sevens with a small horizontal line, the way she said her own mother had taught her. For when you need this, it said at the top, no date beneath it. I have watched your father give this family's faith away to whoever asked the loudest for it, the same way his own father did to him. I will not be here to make sure you are not the one left holding nothing. Ask Gordon for the rest when you are ready. Not before. He knows what I mean. Love, Mom. I sat down on the concrete floor of that basement archive room, with my back against the filing cabinet, still holding the page, and I cried the way I have not cried since the week of her funeral. Loud and shapeless, not the composed, contained grief I had rationed out to myself in every hallway and coat room and driveway over the last 2 weeks. It came up out of me in a way I could not organize or slow down my breath, catching wrong. Both hands pressed flat against my own sternum at one point, as though I could hold something inside my chest from coming apart entirely. The paper crumpling slightly where I gripped it too hard without meaning to. I heard myself make a sound I did not recognize as my own voice, somewhere between a word and nothing, and I let it happen anyway, alone in a basement nobody visits, because there was no version of composure left in me strong enough to perform for an empty room. My mother had been dead 10 years. She had never met Preston as an adult. She had never sat in that boardroom to hear Eleanor Frost say my name like a question nobody wanted to answer. And still she had written this, folded it, clipped it behind a deed that would not even exist for another 7 years after she wrote it, and asked a lawyer to hold it until a day she would never see. I do not know how long I sat there. Long enough that my legs went numb against the cold concrete, long enough that the flickering tube overhead cycled through its habit a dozen times without my registering it. Once long enough that when I finally stood, my knees ached in a way that had nothing to do with sitting on concrete and everything to do with how tightly I had curled myself around that single sheet of paper. I thought about the word faith, the specific word she had chosen, not company, not money, not legacy faith. And I thought about 15 years, the number Patricia had used in the hallway at the party, and about the trust Eleanor had told me to ask my father about, and about a strip of yellowed tape on a file box with my aunt's name on it behind locked glass on the 5th floor. My mother had died 10 years ago. Whatever she had known it before any of that. Before Preston was old enough to be handed anything, before I was old enough to understand what a deed even was. I tried to place her illness against a timeline in my head, the way I place everything, and could not make the math sit still. She had been sick for the better part of 7 years before she died. Somewhere inside that window, sick and running out of time herself, she had found the energy to sit down, write 4 sentences by hand, and ask a lawyer to guard them for a decade she would not live to see the end of. That was not a woman guessing. That was a woman who already knew the shape of something and did not have time left to explain it to a 22-year-old who was not yet ready to hear it. I folded the note along its original creases and did not put it back in the file. I put it in my coat pocket instead, next to the key that had lived there 3 years, 2 small pieces of paper and metal that together weighed almost nothing and had somehow become the heaviest things I owned. Ask Gordon for the rest when you are ready. Not before. He knows what I mean. I read that line 3 more times standing there in the basement, my mother's version of patience reaching across 10 years to tell me exactly what she had told him, which was clearly not everything, because a lawyer who has represented this family for 2 decades does not sit on a piece of information this large without eventually finding a reason to use it. And he had not used it, not once. Not in 3 years of quiet countdowns and careful phone calls. Whatever my mother had known, she had trusted Gordon to decide when I was ready to know it too, and some part of me understood standing in that basement that Friday afternoon might finally be the day I stopped letting other people make that decision for me. I climbed the narrow stairs back up out of the cold, past the disconnected boiler, and stood for a moment in the stairwell doorway before pushing back out into the ordinary fluorescent light of the ground floor lobby. My face doing whatever it was going to do, my coat pocket heavier by one folded page than it had been an hour before. The question I carried back up the stairs was not what my mother had left me. I already knew what she had left me. The question was how a woman who died before any of this began had known with that much certainty that it would. I did not call Gordon that night. I told myself I would call him in the morning when I had slept, when my voice would not do the thing it had done in the basement, and I drove home instead with my mother's note in my coat pocket, and did not take the coat off for almost an hour after I walked in the door. My apartment has one lamp I actually use after dark, a brass reading lamp on the small desk by the window, and I sat down under it a little after 11 with my laptop open and the rest of the rooms dark around me. I had taken the note out of my coat pocket somewhere in that hour and set it on the desk beside the lamp, still folded along its original creases, the brass key resting on top of it, like a paperweight, holding down something that might otherwise blow away. I have a box in my closet, still taped shut, that has moved with me through 3 apartments now, most of what was left of my mother's desk after the estate was settled. I had not opened it in 4 years. I did not open it that night either. I only knew sitting there under the lamp that the box was in the next room, and that I was aware of it, the way you are aware of a person standing just behind you in a doorway. I had not eaten since the sandwich at my desk that afternoon. I did not notice that until I noticed my hands were unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with crying anymore. I opened the drafts folder. The reply to Monica Reyes was still there, 4 sentences exactly where I had left it 2 nights before. I read it again. I changed very interested to available to start within 30 days, a phrase that felt more like a decision and less like an emotion, and I sat looking at that single line for a long time, the cursor blinking in the empty space after it. I was not thinking strategically when my thumb moved toward send. I want to be honest about that the same way I have tried to be honest about every other moment in these last 2 weeks, that I would rather tell as though I were calmer than I actually was. I was not weighing the equity or the deed or my mother's 4 sentences or any of the careful architecture I had been building since Monday of the first week. I was simply tired all the way down. The particular exhaustion of a person who has spent 2 weeks holding several separate versions of herself upright at once. The calm one at the office, the furious one in my father's driveway, the one who cried on a concrete floor an hour ago and had not fully stopped since. And some small, honest part of me just wanted it to be over, wanted an ending that did not require me to keep deciding anything ever again. Boston did not feel like ambition in that moment. It felt like the closest thing available to sleep. My phone rang before my thumb landed. Ruth's name on the screen, 11:40 at night, which she has never once done in the 10 years I have known her. "I did not think you'd be up," I said, answering. "Neither did I," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd see if you could either. There's a lot of us not sleeping this month, I'd guess, though. Most of us won't say so out loud." I could hear her television on low in the background, some old movie, black and white, by the sound of the dialogue, and somewhere underneath it the particular quiet of a house that has been the same house for a long time. We talked about nothing for a minute, the ordinary. Nothing of 2 people checking that the other one is still standing, her granddaughter's dance recital next weekend, a leak in her kitchen ceiling she kept meaning to call someone about. A client account neither of us technically needed to discuss at 11:40 on a Friday, but discussed anyway because it was easier than the actual reason either of us was still awake. I do not know exactly how the conversation turned. I think I said something about needing a change vague enough that I did not fully register. I had said it until I heard the shape of Ruth's silence on the other end of the line. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. Not a question. I told her I was thinking about a lot of things. It was not really an answer, and we both knew it. Ruth was quiet long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. "You have every right to leave, Amelia," she said finally. "Nobody who has watched the last 2 weeks would blame you for it, least of all me. But if you leave now tonight on a decision made at midnight because you are too tired to keep fighting for one more day, you leave everything you built to somebody who does not understand it well enough to keep it standing. And you already know that. I can hear it in your voice. You knew it before you called me. And you knew it back when I found you crying in that kitchen at the yacht club, and I think you knew it 3 years ago too, whatever it is you have never told me about." I sat with the phone against my ear and said nothing for a moment long enough that I heard her television change scenes in the background, a swell of orchestral music from whatever old film she had on low. She did not fill the silence. She has never been a woman who fills silence just to be doing something with her voice. "I am not asking you to tell me," she said gentler. "I am only telling you what I see from where I sit, which is a woman who has spent 10 years making sure this place did not fall down, standing at the exact moment somebody handed her a door, wondering if walking through it makes her strong or just makes her tired. Those are not the same question, and you deserve better than answering the wrong one at midnight." I did not answer her right away. Something in the last part of that sentence landed harder than the rest of it. A door I had not realized was still slightly open. "Get some sleep," she said gentler now. "We will figure out the rest of it tomorrow together the way we figure out everything else. You do not have to decide anything else tonight." We said goodnight. I set the phone down on the desk beside the laptop screen, still open to that unsent reply, 4 sentences and 1 revised phrase sitting there in the lamplight, like something I had almost done and had not quite done. I thought about the way she had said 3 years ago, so specific, so exactly the number I had been carrying since a kitchen table in Simsbury, and I wondered not for the first time that night how much of what I thought was private in my life had actually been visible the whole time to the people who paid close enough attention to notice. Ruth has never once asked me a direct question about the building. She had never needed to. She had simply watched me for 3 years the way she watches everything and filed it away the same patient way I file things myself. For reasons I could not entirely account for, I picked the phone back up, though there was no one left to call, and opened the email again on my laptop instead, cursor blinking at the end of the line, my thumb hovering over, send for exactly as long as it takes to draw 1 full breath and let it out. The screen went dark before I touched it. Autolock 30 seconds of inactivity, a setting I had configured myself years ago and never once thought about until it decided on its own that I had run out of time to make up my mind. I sat there a while longer in the lamplight phone dark laptop screen dimmed to its own autolock, a minute after the apartment quiet except for the radiator ticking somewhere in the wall. My mother's note sat on the desk where I had left it, the brass key still resting on top of it, and somewhere through the wall in the next room, a taped box I had not opened in 4 years, waited exactly where it always waited. Patient in the particular way, only things that cannot ask anything of you are patient. I did not go open it that night either. I turned off the lamp instead and sat a moment longer in the dark, with my coat still draped over the chair, unsure for the first time in 10 years which version of myself I would wake up as in the morning. I woke up Saturday morning still in yesterday's clothes, the lamp still on from the night before, and the first thing I did before coffee, before checking my phone, was open the closet and pull out the taped box I had not touched in 4 years. The tape had gone brittle enough that it split along the fold without much resistance, and the smell that came up out of the box was the smell I remember from the last apartment my mother ever lived in, alone, paper, and the particular dust of things packed away in haste by people who did not know yet how long they would need to stay packed. Most of it was exactly what I expected. A cardigan I had forgotten she owned, soft gray wool gone slightly stiff with age. A ceramic dish shaped like a scallop shell from a trip to Mystic, chipped at one edge, in a way I remembered from the kitchen counter of a house I no longer lived in. A stack of birthday cards in my own childhood handwriting that I could not make myself read that morning and set aside instead, face down, for some later version of myself who might be ready. Near the bottom, wrapped in a scarf I did recognize, blue wool she wore every winter of my adolescence, was a spiral notebook, the cover soft and curled from handling her handwriting on the first page. Household. Nothing more than that. Most of the pages were exactly what the cover promised: grocery lists. A phone number for a plumber crossed out and rewritten twice, notes about a parent-teacher conference in October of a year I would have been in 7th grade. I flipped through it the way you flip through anything mundane that belonged to someone you loved, not expecting to find anything, mostly just wanting my hands to be doing something connected to her. About 2/3 through one page stopped me. Dated in the corner, a Tuesday in March, the year I turned 12. Taught A to read the mortgage statement today. She got it faster than I did at her age. Good. I remember that afternoon, the way you remember very few afternoons from childhood, whole and specific, not worn smooth by retelling, because I had never told anyone about it, not once in 20 years. We lived in Wethersfield then, before the house in West Hartford, a smaller place with a kitchen that got good light in the late afternoon, yellow curtains my mother sewed herself the summer before I started 6th grade. I was doing homework at the table when my mother sat down across from me with a folder I did not recognize, and a cup of tea she did not drink, steam rising off it and going still while she talked. She said she wanted to show me something, and I remember being annoyed. The ordinary annoyance of a 12-year-old asked to look up from her own homework, and then not annoyed anymore, because what she put in front of me was not a lecture. It was our actual mortgage statement, real numbers, the interest rate circled in pencil, the principal balance beneath it. "This is what we owe," she said, "and this is what we are paying toward it, and this is how much of that payment this month actually reduced what we owe versus what just went to the bank for letting us borrow the money in the first place." She walked me through the amortization line by line, patient in a way she was not always patient, tapping the pencil against each figure before moving to the next one. And when I asked her why she was showing me this instead of my father, who handled the money in our house, the way most fathers of that era did, something crossed her face I did not have the vocabulary yet to name. She said the sentence I have carried since, and thought about it more times over the last decade than she probably ever imagined I would. "The numbers on this paper are the only thing in this house that do not lie, Amelia. Everybody in a family can tell you a story about what is really going on. The paper does not care about the story. Learn to read it yourself before somebody else reads it for you and tells you what it says." She never brought it up again. Not that week. Not that year, not once in the 20 years I had left with her. It saddened me the way a single lesson sometimes does, isolated, unrepeated, filed away the same practical way I file everything useful information from a woman who was usually right about things. I understood the reason behind it only years later, after she was gone, piecing together from things people did not quite say that the early years of my parents' marriage had not been as steady as the version I grew up believing, that there had been a stretch when money moved in ways my mother did not fully trust, and that whatever she had lived through in that stretch had convinced her that a daughter who could read her own numbers would never again be as vulnerable as a wife who could not. Sitting on my apartment floor, 32 years old, with that notebook open in my lap, I understood something I had not let myself understand 3 years ago at Gordon's kitchen table, signing my name to a deed with my hand shaking. I had told myself at the time that I was saving my father's company. That was true. It was not the whole truth. I was also doing, without realizing it, exactly what my mother had spent one Tuesday afternoon in March making sure I would know how to do for the rest of my life. I was reading the paper myself instead of trusting somebody else's version of what it meant. I was making sure that whatever happened to this family next, there would be one document nobody could simply narrate around me. I thought, too, about the note in my coat pocket still folded on the desk beside the lamp from the night before, and about the word she had chosen there as well. Faith. Not money, not the company. I wondered whether the stretch of unsteady years she had lived through with my father, whatever it actually was, had taught her something about how easily faith gets handed to whoever performs need the loudest. The way Patricia had performed it in that hallway. The way Preston was performing it now without ever having asked to. My mother had not needed to know the specific shape my father's mistakes would eventually take. She had only needed to know the shape of the man early enough and clearly enough to build me a door out of paper before she ran out of time to build anything else. The strange thing that replaced Friday's grief was not forgiveness, not exactly, not of my father, not of anyone. It was something quieter than that, closer to understanding. 3 years of silence, 3 years of carrying a key and never once using what it opened had not been fear and had not been weakness. It had been exactly what my mother taught me paper was for. Protection, not attack. A place to stand, not a weapon to swing. For the first time since Saturday night at the yacht club, the fact of my own restraint stopped feeling like something that had been done to me, some inherited caution I had never chosen, and started feeling like something I had actually built on purpose, brick by brick, out of a lesson given to me at a kitchen table 20 years ago by a woman who did not live long enough to see whether I would use it correctly. I closed the notebook and sat with that thought a while, the apartment bright now with actual morning light instead of lamplight, and underneath the quiet I had finally found one question sat that I did not have an answer for yet. If paper was only ever meant to protect me, at what point did protecting myself in silence become something closer to letting everyone else decide one quiet week at a time exactly how much of myself I was allowed to keep? I got up eventually, knees stiff from sitting on the floor for the second time in 2 days, and put the notebook on the desk beside the lamp next to my mother's note, and the brass key, 3 small objects that had somehow become the only furniture in the room that mattered. I made coffee I did not really want. I looked at the clock, 9:40, and thought about Gordon, awake by now, surely waiting for a call I had told him I would make, once I understood what I actually wanted to say. I was not ready yet. Not quite, but for the first time since Saturday night at the yacht club, I understood that the woman who would eventually make that call was not improvising. She had been trained for this her whole life at a kitchen table in Wethersfield, by someone who had known decades in advance that this particular Saturday morning would eventually come. Gordon's office sits on the second floor of a converted colonial on the Simsbury Green, exposed beams a window with old wavy glass that turns the maples outside into something slightly underwater. I called him Monday morning the way I had promised myself I would, and he asked me to come in person rather than talk on the phone, which told me most of what I needed to know before I even sat down across from his desk. His secretary, a woman named Louise who has worked for him almost as long as he has represented my family, brought in 2 coffees without being asked, and closed the door behind her on her way out, which she has never done for any other meeting of mine I have attended in that office. The room smelled faintly of the wood smoke from a fireplace 2 doors down that nobody had lit yet this season, and the light through the blinds fell in even stripes across the papers already stacked on Gordon's desk, squared at the corners the way he always keeps them, a small deliberate order in a room about to hold a conversation that was not orderly at all. Gordon waited until the latch clicked before he spoke. 6 days until closing, he said, no preamble, sliding a single sheet toward me with a date circled in blue ink. Both transactions now. The equity restructuring and the building refinance closing together. Same room, same signatures. I told him I remembered. Bradford Shaw's email had said as much days ago, the 2 transactions bundled into one closing package exactly the way he had written it. Gordon folded his hands on the desk, and for the first time since I had known him professionally, he looked genuinely uncertain how to begin a sentence. He is a man who has delivered difficult news to this family across 2 decades, without ever once fumbling the opening line, and watching him search for one, told me before he said another word that whatever came next was not routine. Your father called me last night, he said. Not through Walsh. Not through Bradford Shaw. Directly at home after 9. He wants me to draw up paperwork for you to sign back your interest in the building before the title search results go into the closing file. A token transfer. $1 standard language, the kind of thing that looks routine to anyone who isn't looking closely. I asked him what my father was offering in exchange. Nothing, Gordon said. That's the part I need you to understand correctly. He isn't offering you anything, and he isn't trying to cheat you out of anything either, whatever it might look like from where you're sitting. He's trying to clean something up quietly before it becomes public and embarrasses him in front of a bank, a board, and a nephew who still thinks this transition is clean. That is a different thing than malice, Amelia. I have watched the 2 of you for 32 years. And I do not think your father has ever once in his life known how to ask for help, without also trying to make sure nobody sees him needing it. I asked Gordon what he had told my father. I told him I would speak with you, he said. I did not tell him I would convince you of anything. That is not a promise I have any intention of keeping to him or to anyone, and I want you to hear that clearly before we go any further. Your mother did not put me in that basement file to help your father clean up after himself. I have kept my end of that for 3 years. I am not about to stop now because a closing date makes everyone nervous. I should tell you the other side of this too, he added, because I would not be doing my job if I let you walk out of here thinking there was no cost to refusing. If you do not sign and the title search results land in that closing file, the way they are scheduled to your name becomes a fact everyone in that room has to deal with, in real time, in front of the bank, in front of the board members who get copied on closing documents in front of Preston. There is no version of this where the truth comes out and stays quiet. You would be choosing the harder room on purpose. He slid a second sheet across the desk, the quitclaim already drafted, my name already typed into the blank, where a signature would go, a dotted line, waiting under it like a held breath. I picked up the pen sitting in the little dish beside the papers, an ordinary black pen. Nothing about it should have mattered, and I sat there holding it longer than I meant to. I was not afraid sitting there. I want to be precise about that because it would be easier to tell this as fear, some old instinct flinching away from confrontation. What moved my hand toward that dotted line was not fear. It was the same thing my mother had tried to warn me about, and had also, without meaning to, taught me to feel automatically, a lifetime of watching a family choose quiet over honest. Choose the version of events that let everyone keep their seat at the table over the version that was simply true. Signing this would end it cleanly. Nobody at the closing would ever have to watch my father's face do whatever it was going to do when the title search confirmed what he already quietly knew. Preston would never have to learn in a room full of bankers that the transition he had been handed rested on ground somebody else had spent 3 years standing on. I could give everyone in that room the version of events where nothing unusual had ever happened here at all. I thought about the word faith again, sitting there with the pen an inch above the paper. I thought about whether signing this was protection the way my mother meant it, or whether it was the opposite, one more quiet accommodation dressed up as peace, the exact pattern Patricia had described in that hallway. Whoever asks for calm, the loudest gets it at somebody else's expense. My father was not asking loudly. He never has. He asks the way he always asks, through someone else, at 9 at night. Hoping the request arrives softened enough by the time it reaches me that I forget to notice it is still underneath the softening, a request that I disappear quietly for his convenience one more time. I set the pen down without signing. "Give me until the closing date," I said. Gordon did not ask why, and he did not try to talk me further in either direction, which I have come to understand is the specific kind of loyalty he has always offered this family, careful, exact, never pushing past the edge of what belonged to him to decide. He nodded, once gathered the unsigned page back into its folder, and told me he would see me in 6 days, whatever I decided to bring with me. I asked him on my way out whether he was going to tell my father I had not signed. "He is going to assume you are still thinking about it," Gordon said. "That will not be a lie. I would let him keep assuming that for as long as it serves you to let him." I drove back toward Hartford with the unsigned quitclaim, never leaving Gordon's desk, 6 days sitting ahead of me, like a number I had finally stopped trying to avoid the maples along Route 10, already turning the same gold as the ones outside his window. And I understood somewhere past the Simsbury town line that the version of myself who had almost signed that page in the first 10 seconds of holding the pen was not a version I needed to be ashamed of. She had simply been the daughter my father had spent 32 years training me to be. The one who set the pen down was someone else entirely, someone I was still 6 days out from finding out for certain in the process of becoming. I had not answered Monica Reyes either in the days since that Saturday morning with the notebook on my lap. The draft still sat in my folder named Later Unsent, and I had stopped feeling the pressure to resolve it immediately the way I had that first night under the lamp. Some decisions I was learning did not need to be made before they needed to be made. I could hold 2 open doors at once without walking through either of them yet, as long as I was honest with myself about which one I was actually leaning toward, when nobody was asking me to decide. I called Ruth that evening and told her about the meeting briefly, not the full shape of it, but enough. She did not ask why I had refused to sign. She only asked if I was eating enough, which was her way of saying she trusted whatever I had decided without needing the reasons spelled out for her, and I found that I did not mind for once letting someone else's trust stand in for an explanation I was not yet ready to give. My phone rang at 10 o'clock on Wednesday night, 4 days out from the closing Preston's name on the screen for the first time since the night of the party. I was sitting on my couch with the television on low, not really watching it. My mother's notebook still on the desk across the room where I had left it days ago, and I almost let the call go to voicemail. Some old habit made me answer instead. "I need to say some things, and I need to say them fast before I lose my nerve," he said, before I had even gotten my own hello out fully. His voice was doing something I had not heard from him before, not the careful, polished tone he uses in client meetings, something rougher underneath it, closer to how he had sounded that first night standing alone by the banquet table with a glass he never drank from. I muted the television and sat forward. "I never asked for this, Amelia. I want you to hear that from me directly, not through my mother, not through your father from me. My mother fought your father for the better part of a year to keep me out of this seat. I did not know that until 3 weeks ago. I thought this whole thing was my idea, or at least something I had agreed to want. I found out it was never really a choice I made. I asked him what changed 3 weeks ago. I overheard something I was not supposed to overhear, he said, and did not elaborate further on it. And I did not push, because I recognized the shape of a person deciding in real time how much of a private conversation belonged to them to repeat. There's a version of my whole life, he went on, where I have spent it trying to fix something that happened before I was old enough to understand it needed fixing. Nobody ever explained the rules to me. I just always knew there was a debt in this family with my name attached to it, and that someday I was supposed to be the one who paid it back by being exactly the kind of son your father never quite got to have himself. I am not that. I was never going to be that. I have known it since I was maybe 15, standing in that same fifth-floor hallway at some holiday party watching your father look at me like I was a down payment on something, and I have spent every year since pretending otherwise because it felt like the only currency I had to offer anyone who mattered to me. I thought about the empty office with my aunt's name on yellowed tape behind locked glass, and about a version of Preston 15 years old, standing in that same hallway absorbing whatever weight had already been placed on him before he understood its shape. I did not say anything for a moment. Whatever anger I still carried toward him from the last 3 weeks did not disappear exactly, but it moved, made room for something else standing next to it. "What are you asking me?" I said finally. "I want to withdraw publicly in front of the board before the closing. I will tell them I am not ready, that the transition should not have happened the way it did, and I will back whatever you decide to do next. I am not doing this only for you. I want to be honest about that too. I have a job offer of my own from a marine conservation nonprofit down in Mystic Work. I actually understand work nobody handed me out of guilt. I have been sitting on it for 2 weeks, the same way, I suspect. You have been sitting on something of your own." I asked him how he knew that. "I don't," he said. "I'm guessing. But you have had the same look on your face for 2 weeks that I've had for 2 months. So I'm guessing." I sat with that for a moment, the particular strangeness of hearing someone I had spent 3 weeks quietly resenting describe an exhaustion that matched my own closely enough to recognize on sight. I thought about Katie arranging a monstera plant in an office that had never been his idea, about the engraved nameplate ordered before anyone asked him if he wanted his name on it. About a man drinking champagne he never wanted at a party thrown in his honor by people who had never once asked him what he wanted at all. I had spent 3 weeks building him into the shape of the person who took what was mine. He had spent apparently considerably longer than 3 weeks failing to build himself into the shape anyone actually wanted him to become. "Tell me about the nonprofit," I said, mostly because I did not know what else to say, and did not want the silence to close back over whatever he had just opened. He talked for a minute about coastal restoration work along the Sound Oyster Reef projects, near where his father had died, work that had nothing to do with reinsurance treaties or board resolutions or any of the language he had spent 18 months failing to learn fluently. His voice changed while he talked about it. Lighter, faster, the voice of someone describing something they actually wanted, rather than something they had been assigned. "I have been out there on weekends for a year now," he said. "Nobody in this family knows. It felt easier to keep it small, something that was only mine, before I had to decide whether I was allowed to want it more than I wanted to be useful to everyone else." I told him I understood that better than he probably realized. I told him I needed to think about it, the offer, the timing, all of it, and he said that was fair, that he was not calling to rush me into anything, only to make sure I knew the offer existed before the closing made everyone's choices smaller. "I want you to know," he added, "that this is not me being generous. I have thought about it a lot the last few weeks, and generous is not the right word for a man finally admitting he never wanted the thing he was handed. Generous would be pretending I'm giving something up. I'm not. I'm just finally telling the truth about what I already knew." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and he let the silence sit there a moment without rushing to fill it, which was, I realized, not a thing I had ever once seen my father do in 32 years. There's one more thing he said right before he would have hung up his voice, dropping into something quieter and more deliberate than anything else he had said all call. I think you should ask your father about 2011. I asked him what happened in 2011. I don't fully know, he said. I know it's the year my mother stopped working at the company. I know it's the year she stopped speaking to your father for almost 2 years. Afterward, a stretch of my childhood, I remember mostly as two people who used to laugh at each other's jokes suddenly not being in the same room for any holiday that mattered. Nobody in my house has ever said the word out loud in front of me, not once in 15 years. I only know it matters because of the specific way silence sits in a room when I bring the year up by accident, which I have learned the hard way not to do at family dinners anymore. My mother gets a look on her face like someone stepping around a hole in the floor she has memorized the shape of. I asked him if he had ever asked her directly. Once he said. She told me it was not her story to tell alone, and that if I really wanted to know, I should ask your father because, whatever happened, he was the one who made the choice that mattered. She has never said another word about it since. And I have never pushed, because some part of me has always understood that pushing would cost her something I was not willing to make her pay. He hung up before I could ask him anything else, and I sat there in my apartment with the phone still warm against my ear, the television still muted and flickering silently in the corner, the number 2011 sitting in the space where a question used to be, one more piece handed to me by someone who did not have the whole shape of it either, only the outline of a silence he had grown up inside of without ever being told what it was protecting him from. I set the phone down on the couch cushion beside me and did not turn the television back on. 4 days until closing, and the list of things I did not yet fully understand about my own family had somehow grown longer instead of shorter, with every single person who tried to hand me one more piece of it. I got to Gordon's office 20 minutes early that morning, sat in my car in the small gravel lot behind the converted Colonial, with the engine off, watching rain collect on the windshield in slow, deliberate beads. I had not slept well. I had not expected to. I had spent the 6 days since our last meeting reading every document Gordon sent me twice, sometimes 3 times the same discipline my mother had taught me at a kitchen table 20 years earlier. And by the morning of the closing, I understood exactly what I was walking into, and still did not know with any certainty what I was going to do once I got there. Gordon's conference room felt smaller than I remembered it. 6 people around a table built for 8 closing binders stacked at each place, setting thick enough to stop a door. Rain had started sometime that morning, the kind of steady October rain that turns the Simsbury Green outside the window, gray and quiet, and I remember being grateful for it, for the ordinary sound of it against the glass, something in the room that was not waiting for anything. Carla Jennings sat at the head, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, methodical in the specific way. Bank closing attorneys are methodical turning pages, like a woman who has done this exact motion 4,000 times and trusts nothing until she has seen it herself. My father sat across from me in a suit I recognized from board meetings, hands folded on the table with a stillness that cost him something to maintain. Preston sat beside him, quieter than I had ever seen him in a professional setting, his hands folded on the table in front of him, like a man trying to take up less room than his body actually occupied. Walsh and Bradford Shaw sat at the far end, laptops open, the particular alert posture of people whose job it is to notice problems before anyone else in the room does. Gordon sat beside me, closer than the seating chart strictly required, a small thing I noticed and did not comment on. I had not told Gordon what I was going to do. I had not fully known myself, not with certainty, until I sat down at that table and felt the brass key in my coat pocket against my hip, the way it had sat there every single day for 3 years. Carla worked through the equity restructuring documents, first clean routine initials collected around the table in the ordinary rhythm of a transaction nobody in the room expected trouble from. Then she reached the building refinance package, flipped to the recorded ownership page, and stopped. I need both co-owners' signatures on the deed of trust before this closing can proceed, she said, not looking up yet still reading. Richard Davis and Amelia Davis tenants in common. I have Mr. Davis's signature page here. I do not see Miss Davis listed on today's signing schedule. Bradford Shaw's pen stopped over his legal pad, hovering the way a pen hovers when a lawyer is recalculating an entire closing in real time without wanting to look like he is recalculating anything. Walsh looked up from his laptop the way you look up when a number on a spreadsheet does not match a number. You memorize the particular blank stillness of a CFO, discovering a variable nobody had entered into his model. Preston's eyes went to me first before they went to my father. And I understood watching him that whatever he had pieced together in the last 2 weeks had not included this particular detail. His mouth opened slightly and closed again, without saying anything, the posture of a man deciding correctly that this was not the moment for him to speak. I thought in the half-second before I answered about a folded note in a coat pocket, 4 sentences in my mother's handwriting, and about a word she had chosen on purpose. Faith, not money. I was not sitting in that chair to punish anyone. I was sitting there because a woman who died 10 years ago had made sure I would have a place to stand exactly like this one, whether or not I ever needed to use it, and some part of me understood finally, sitting under Gordon's fluorescent lights with rain against the window, that using it was not a betrayal of anything she taught me. It was the entire point. My father turned to look at me. He was not surprised. I had known since Gordon's office 6 days earlier that he was not going to be surprised that whatever version of this moment he had built in his head over the past week had already accounted for my name appearing on that page. What his face was actually asking in the half-second before either of us said anything was a different question entirely. Whether I was going to do this here, now, in front of Preston, in front of a bank, in front of 2 attorneys who would carry the story of this exact moment back to their own offices before the end of the day. I watched him decide in real time not to fill that silence himself, which was its own kind of answer, a man who had spent 3 weeks trying to control the timing of every conversation in this building, finally understanding he no longer controlled the timing of this one. I am the signature you're looking for, I said to Carla, not to him. She looked at me properly for the first time, adjusting her glasses. I need a few more days before I sign anything related to this building, I said. My voice came out even quieter than I expected, nothing close to the speech I might have written for this moment if I had let myself write one in advance. I am not refusing. I am asking for time to review the terms properly before I commit my name to them. Carla set down her pen. Without both signatures today, she said, we cannot fund. The rate lock expires Friday. I would need to speak with underwriting about what a delay of this kind does to the terms currently on the table. I watched the arithmetic move around that table in real time, Bradford Shaw doing the math on what a blown rate lock did to a bundled transaction he had built to close as one clean package, Walsh's jaw working the way it does. Before he says something he will need to soften afterward, Preston sitting very still watching his uncle's face rather than mine, the way you watch weather instead of the thing the weather is about to hit. Nobody in that room said the word deed out loud or 3 years, or asked the obvious next question, which was how a co-ownership interest signed a decade into my father's tenure as sole recorded owner had never once in 3 years appeared in a single conversation any of them had been part of. They did not need to ask it aloud. I watched it land on each face separately, the specific understanding that whatever they had assumed about who actually held final say over this building, over this transition over the last 3 weeks of carefully orchestrated paperwork, had never been entirely accurate. I did not feel triumphant sitting there. I want to be honest about that because it would be a cleaner story to tell if I had. What I felt watching Bradford Shaw quietly close his laptop and watching Walsh reach for his phone to call someone who was not in this room was something closer to grief. Oddly, grief for how simple this could have been 3 years ago if anyone in this family had ever once made room for a conversation instead of a closing. My father did not raise his voice. He has never once raised his voice at me in a room full of other people, and he did not start that day. He leaned toward me slightly close enough that his next words reached only me, not Carla, not Bradford Shaw, not Preston watching us both from 2 seats down. Beside me, Gordon had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man who has waited 3 years for a conversation. He is not going to be the one to interrupt, now that it has finally arrived. I felt more than saw his hand shift an inch closer to mine on the table, not touching. Just present the way Ruth had been present in a kitchen doorway, the way Preston's voice had been present on a phone line, at 10 at night. Small evidence gathering all week. That I had not been carrying any of this as alone as it had felt for most of the last 3 years. "How long do you intend to hold on to it?" He asked, quiet enough that I had to lean in slightly myself to be certain I had heard him correctly. His face gone, the pale, unfamiliar color of a man watching a number he had never bothered to check. Finally come due. 6 weeks after the closing that never happened the way anyone in that room expected it to, I sat at my desk on the 4th floor of the Davis building with a new plate on the door. Amelia Davis, Director of Risk Strategy. Not the corner office, not my name on the letterhead as anyone's successor. The board in the end hired a CEO from outside the family, entirely a woman named Priscilla Ahn, who had run risk for a mid-sized carrier in Providence for 11 years and had never once, in her first month, needed anyone to explain to her who actually understood this company's numbers. She found me on her second day, introduced herself properly, and asked to see the coastal flood model I had built at 24, not because anyone told her to, but because she had apparently read the file before she ever accepted the offer. I will not tell you I got everything I wanted that night at the yacht club, because I did not, and I have stopped pretending to myself that not getting it costs nothing. There is a version of this story where I ended up in the chair my father raised his glass toward, and this is not that version. What I got instead was smaller, and it turns out harder to argue with. Real authority over the thing I actually know how to do. A title that finally matches the work. 6 years overdue in arriving anyway. A board that asks for my analysis in the room instead of finding it secondhand through somebody else's mouth. My name back on the distribution list first entry where it has stayed every quarter since. I expected accepting all of that to feel like a loss I was managing. Some mornings it still does. Most mornings lately it does not. Preston moved into client relations in October, a role built mostly out of the ruins of the one nobody should have handed him in the first place. He is good at it in a way that surprised exactly nobody who watched him charm Tom Kessler through an entire dinner without understanding a single number underneath the charm. He and I have lunch together most Fridays now, an arrangement neither of us planned or announced. And he still spends most of it talking about oyster reefs he visits on weekends, whether or not the company technically needs him to be anywhere near the water. He texted me the week his transfer went through 4 words. No explanation needed between us anymore. Thanks for not sinking me. Ruth retires next spring. She told me over coffee last week, matter of fact, the way she tells me everything, and asked whether I intended to hire someone half as difficult to replace her, which is her way of asking whether I would miss her, and I told her nobody could replace her at all, which is closer to the truth than either of us usually allows ourselves to say out loud. I never sent Monica Reyes the 4 sentences I drafted under a lamp 2 months ago. I wrote her a different email instead, Shorter, the kind of decision that did not require careful phrasing, because it was not really a hard decision by the time I made it. I told her I was staying not because anything was holding me here anymore, but because I had finally built something worth staying for on my own terms rather than somebody else's. She wished me well. I believed her. My father and I have had dinner exactly twice since the closing date. Both times at his house, both times quiet in ways that still catch in my throat if I let them, long stretches where neither of us reaches for the easy subject because the easy subjects all seem to lead back to the same 6 weeks we have not fully discussed yet. He asked about work the first time, careful, formal, almost like a man interviewing his own daughter for a job he already knew she was qualified for. I asked about Patricia the second time, carefully over a dessert. Neither of us finished and watched him decide not to answer. Not unkindly, just not yet. His eyes going briefly to some point past my shoulder, the same way they had in that 5th-floor hallway weeks earlier. I let him have that the same way Gordon let me have my own 6 days once, because I have learned this year, if nothing else, that some doors open faster when nobody is pulling on them. The schooner in his den is still half-rigged. I noticed that the second dinner, standing in his doorway for a moment before we sat down, the same unfinished mast, the same 30 years of not quite getting to it. I did not ask him about that either. Some things I am learning get their own turn. The brass key sits on my desk now, not in my coat pocket. I moved it there the week after the closing, propped against a small dish I keep loose paper clips in plain sight of anyone who comes into my office, though nobody who sees it there has ever asked what it opens. I like it there. It has stopped being a thing I carry in secret and started being a thing I simply own, the way my mother, I think, always meant for it to end up eventually. Sitting in the open rather than hidden in a coat pocket against my hip. I was finishing a coverage memo tonight later than I meant to stay, the building mostly dark around me, the way it was that first Monday morning 6 weeks ago. Roberto's buffer humming somewhere down on the lobby floor, the fluorescent light over my desk holding steady this time, no flicker. Someone had finally fixed it without my ever asking. My phone lit up on the desk beside the key. A voicemail. My father's number. The little timestamp beside it read 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Longer than any message he has left me in 32 years, longer than every voicemail he has ever left me combined, probably if I added them all up the way I add up everything else. I looked at it for a while, the office quiet around me, rain starting again somewhere against the window the same way it had the morning of the closing. I did not press play. I pressed play a little after 9 that night alone in my apartment. The brass key sitting on the kitchen counter where I had set it down when I got home, rain still coming down outside, the same way it had all week. Steady, unhurried, the kind of rain that makes a small apartment feel smaller and quieter than it actually is. Amelia. His voice started, then stopped, a long breath audible before he tried again. Amelia. I have started this message 4 times now and deleted it 4 times, so I am just going to say it badly instead of not saying it at all. He talked about Patricia. Not carefully, not the way he talks in boardrooms, sentences starting and doubling back on themselves the way people talk when they have never once practiced the words out loud. In 2011, after Charles died, your grandfather wanted to set up a trust in her name, real equity, a real seat on the board attached to it, not a courtesy one. I was next in line by then, and I told myself I was worried about precedent, about diluting what Dad had built, and none of that was really it. The truth is, I was 29 years old and terrified that if she had a real seat at that table, everyone would finally see she was better at this than I was, and had been the whole time. I said things to your grandfather I have spent 15 years wishing I could take back. I did not fight for her. I let the trust die quietly in committee instead, the way silence in this family has always been allowed to decide things nobody wants to say out loud. His voice cracked on the word silence. I sat very still on my couch phone against my ear, listening to a version of my father I had never once heard in 32 years of knowing him. She left within the month. She did not speak to me for almost 2 years. I told myself the debt was paid when Preston was old enough that I could finally do something. Give him something, make it right through him, since I could not make it right with her directly. I never once asked either of them if that was what they actually needed. I just needed to stop owing something, and I picked the fastest way to stop feeling it instead of the right way. And then I did the exact same thing to you. I watched myself do it at the yacht club, glass in my hand, and some part of me knew, even as I was saying it, that I was solving my guilt about your aunt by creating an identical debt with my own daughter. I do not have an excuse for that. I only have the pattern, and I am tired of pretending I do not see it now that it is standing in front of me twice. The message ended there, 4 minutes, 11 seconds, 1 second short of what the timestamp had promised, as though he had run out of words exactly when he ran out of nerve. I sat with the phone still against my ear for a long moment after his voice stopped, listening to nothing but the small mechanical hum of the recording having ended, the rain still ticking against the window behind me. I called him back. He picked up before the first ring finished, like a man who had been sitting with the phone in his hand since he hung up. I am not asking you to forgive any of it tonight, he said, quiet, none of the boardroom left in his voice at all. I am asking you to let me be the one who tells Patricia I finally said it out loud. I owe her that before I owe you anything else. I told him that sounded right. I did not tell him I forgave him. I did not tell him I did not. I only told him I would call him Sunday, and he said Sunday, like a man grateful to be handed a date instead of an answer. And we stayed on the line another moment, neither of us saying anything. Both of us finally, for the first time in 32 years, sitting in the same silence on purpose instead of hiding inside it. After we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time with the phone dark in my lap, the rain still going outside, and I did not cry, and I did not feel the strange peace I had felt on the floor of my mother's basement archive weeks earlier either. I felt something plainer than either of those things. Tired, mostly the particular tiredness of finally hearing a true sentence you have been waiting 15 years to hear, and discovering that truth once spoken does not undo anything. It only makes the undoing possible eventually on its own slower schedule. It has been a little over 2 months now since that night at the yacht club, and I still keep the brass key on my desk instead of in my pocket. And some mornings I still catch myself waiting for someone to tell me I do not belong in the room I am sitting in. I do not think that feeling ever fully leaves you. I think you just get better at recognizing it as an old habit instead of a true fact, and that recognition, small as it sounds, is most of what this whole thing turned out to be about. I keep thinking about the version of myself who sat in that coat room the night of the party, hand closed around a key. Nobody could explain, telling herself she was fine. She was not lying exactly. She really did believe in that moment that composure was the same thing as strength. It took me the better part of 2 months to understand. Those are not the same thing either, and I suspect some of you already know that better than I did, because you learned it the hard way, the way most of us do. A long time before anyone thought to warn you. I did not tell you this story so you would be angry at my father, though I know some of you are, and I understand why. I told you this story because I think a lot of you have spent years doing invisible work for people who loved you in their own limited way, and never once thought to say your name out loud when it mattered. I think a lot of you have folded a piece of yourself down small enough to fit into whatever space your family had left over the way I did for 10 years. And I think some of you are still doing it right now tonight while this plays in the background of a kitchen or a car or a quiet house that used to have more people in it. Here is the truth I did not expect to find at the end of all this. My mother did not leave me a weapon. She left me a place to stand. Those are not the same thing, and I spent 3 years confusing them, thinking that carrying that key in silence meant I was weak, or scared, or waiting for permission I was never going to get. I was not weak. I was protecting something the only way she ever taught me how, and it turned out that protecting yourself quietly for years, without anyone ever knowing the cost of it, is its own kind of strength, even when nobody claps for it, even when nobody ever finds out until the day it finally matters. If you are the one in your family who reads the fine print, who remembers the dates, who quietly keeps things running while somebody else gets thanked for it, I want you to hear this clearly. That is not a small role. That is not the consolation prize. The people who actually hold a family together are almost never the ones standing at the front of the room when the toast gets raised, and if nobody has told you that your steadiness is the reason the roof is still on the house, I am telling you now, it is. Maybe for you, it was not a deed to a building. Maybe it was the checkbook nobody else wanted to balance, or the medical paperwork you filled out alone at a kitchen table while everyone else got to fall apart, or the phone calls to a lawyer you made in secret, because saying it out loud too early would have cost you something you were not ready to lose yet. Whatever your version of that key was, I hope somebody eventually tells you what I am telling you now. Carrying it quietly was never the failure. Using it too soon before you understood its full weight would have been. I also want to say something about my father because I think it would be too easy to end this story pretending he was only ever the villain in it. He was not honest with me for most of my life. He built an entire architecture of avoidance out of guilt he never once said out loud, and it cost his sister a decade of her life, and cost me 3 weeks of mine that I will never fully get back. I do not say that to excuse him. I say it because I have come to believe most family betrayals are not committed by monsters. They are committed by exhausted, frightened people who never learned another way to carry what they were carrying, and who pass that same silence down to the next person in line without ever meaning to the way my father passed it to me, the same way his own father, I suspect, once passed it to him. But the night he finally said it badly into a voicemail, he tried and deleted 4 times before he let himself send it. I heard something I had been waiting 32 years to hear. Not an excuse, just the truth, spoken late, spoken imperfectly, spoken anyway. I do not know yet what to do with that. I am still deciding the same way I am still deciding what to do with a folder in my email named Later that I have not fully closed even now. Some things do not resolve on a schedule. I have stopped expecting them to. If somebody in your life owes you an apology they have never gotten around to giving, I cannot promise you it is coming, and I cannot promise you it will feel like enough when it finally does. What I can tell you is that waiting for it is not the same as needing it, and you can build an entire life, a real one, standing on ground. You secured yourself long before anyone else finds the courage to admit what they took from you along the way. My mother never lived to see any of this. She never met the woman I became at that closing table, never knew whether the paper she left behind would matter or simply sit forgotten in a basement file for the rest of time. She built it anyway, on faith alone, the same word she chose in that note, and I think that is the real inheritance in this story. Not the building, not the equity, the faith that someone you love enough will eventually need solid ground, and the discipline to build it for them years before you can be certain they ever will. This is Stillwater Stories, and if any part of tonight sounded like your own kitchen table, your own family's silence, your own quiet years of carrying something nobody else noticed, I would like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and what the paper in your own life has been the thing you have been protecting quietly, waiting for the day you might actually need it. If this story mattered to you, follow the channel. And share it with someone you know who has spent too long believing their steadiness does not count as strength. I still have not fully unpacked the box in my closet. I still have not called my Aunt Patricia, though I think before winter, I finally will. And some nights when the office is empty and the light over my desk holds steady, the way it finally does. Now, I pick up that brass key and I do not put it back down right away. I just hold it, turning it over once in my palm the way my mother must have turned it over in hers, decades before I was ever old enough to understand what it was for. And I think about all the other keys sitting in all the other coat pockets tonight in all the other kitchens where somebody is still deciding whether protecting themselves quietly is the same thing as giving up. It never was. I know that now. I am still learning exactly what to do with knowing it.